Edward slowly drove out of the office parking lot and headed towards the center. The businessman's car maneuvered confidently between the rows of cars, the owners of which in about 10 or 20 minutes would quite expectedly hit rush hour, tuning the radio to his favorite wave. Edward Reynolds wondered how his son Volland was doing. Was Stacey doing well? It's tough. 7 years in the same wheelchair, and why should the little one have to go through such an ordeal? Tears glistened in the corners of the businessman's eyes. The recent conversation with Jacob, the pediatric orthopedist, came to mind. What can I say, Edward? I've examined Volland, and I'll tell you this, I found no abnormalities. You see, I've told you before, and I'll tell you again, your son's ailment is not physical, but rather psychological. So Volland has no injuries or trauma. Will he be able to walk as he used to? Edward asked hopefully. The doctor furrowed his brow, trying to find the right words for the businessman. Depends on what you mean by the word injury. Of course, as such in terms of the physical, your son doesn't have one. But the psyche is a special thing, little studied. As they say, nothing is certain. No, don't be frightened, of course. Your son will overcome the disease and get back on his feet. But it's very, very, very early to talk about any specific time frame. Edward sighed sadly. Jacob had given him hope, and then he'd taken it away. Now, as he thought back to the conversation with the doctor, Edward could barely contain the despair that was gripping him. Volland's mother had died when he was 2 years old. The boy barely remembered her and had only seen her in photographs. 8 months ago, his stepmother appeared in his life. Edward lived alone for about 5 years, devoting himself completely to his son. But when that terrible robbery happened and Volland stopped walking, he realized that they couldn't go anywhere without a woman's hand. The only problem for Edward was choosing medical personnel for his son, simply put, a nurse. Volland had the temperament of his late grandfather, and it was very difficult to please him. All Edward could hear was, "Dad, don't take offense, but Vicky's no good for me. She won't read books, and she sits on her phone all day. She's even worse than the last auntie, but she plays with me. It's true, she does it by force. But I can feel her eyes are lifeless, like she's a robot." Like something out of a space movie, Edward's heart clenched in pity. What could be easier than finding a caregiver for a little boy? But in reality, it was a lottery of one way or the other. Stacey had tried, too. No luck. And she needs a new nurse. But where do we find one? Everyone's used to a nurse taking care of a bedridden patient. And here's a boy who can't walk, but has a lot of energy. That's where the difficulties arise. The businessman thought on his way home and decided to stop at the store. Edward pulled into the parking lot in front of the supermarket. He knew that Stacey didn't like going to grocery stores, so he'd taken on that responsibility recently. Business partner Jonathan only chuckled when he found Eddie's fiancée. "First time I've ever seen a man think about what to make for dinner. What's your job? To provide for your family. To have something to buy bread with, preferably with butter. The rest is up to her." Edward blushed at such remarks and tried to turn the conversation to another direction as quickly as possible. For him, growing up in the countryside, going to the store was no big deal. The most important thing was to have something to go to the store with, and the rest was nothing. When he entered the supermarket, Edward picked up his basket and headed for the freshly baked goods section. Volland loved sweets, and he tried to spoil him from time to time. Fresh cinnamon buns, pies with cherries, pears, jam, and more. His eyes widened. Suddenly, Edward's attention was drawn to the sound of Penelope. It was coming from the neighboring convenience store. "Help, somebody. There's a man down here. Call an ambulance, please." Edward flinched and reached for his pocket, forgetting that he'd left his smartphone in the car. "Hey, for fuck's sake. Okay, gotta see what's what." Maybe some other help is needed when the businessman walked into the neighboring department. A sad picture unfolded before his eyes. An elderly man, a pensioner, lay on his back with no outward signs of life. Nearby, a basket with a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a couple of packs of breadcrumbs, which had toppled over during the fall, was lying orphaned. The people surrounding the man stood around, unsure of what to do next. Or maybe he's just drunk, put forward one of the eyewitnesses a completely ridiculous hypothesis. "What are you, a man?" Ivan is intelligent and clutched at his heart. "I saw him. I was standing about 5 meters away from him," objected a woman. Suddenly, someone pulled Edward aside and squeezed his way to the center of the circle of people that had formed. "Disperse, please. Allow me," came a pleasant female voice. The businessman shifted his gaze to the stranger who had volunteered to help and literally froze on the spot with amazement. It was a real tramp. No, not dirty, of course. And no odor of alcohol or cigarettes. But the clothes and shoes left a lot to be desired. Plus an old, worn-out Penelope cloak. But the main thing was not even in this. but in the fact that, kneeling down, this stranger about 30 years old began to do Grandpa indirect heart massage. Everyone gasped in surprise, as if they wanted to do the same thing before, but just did not have time. And that's when the unwitting spectators of the unfolding drama went and began to fuss around, trying to help. Someone dialed the number of the ambulance. Someone gave advice, valuable and not so valuable. However, the woman did everything as it should be done, and the confirmation of this was a quiet wheeze from the chest of a man lying on the floor. "Thank God, alive," ran through the crowd. Just as the ambulance arrived, the paramedics rushing to the scene entered the supermarket lobby. The tramp disappeared into the crowd and was about to disappear when Edward touched her arm. "Oh, wait, don't go. Would you like a ride?" The woman looked ironically at the respectable businessman standing in front of her. "You will. And why?" "I don't think you want to ask me out. Then what's this all about?" "I'm not too far away, so thank you, but I'll pass." Edward blushed embarrassed, but he didn't back down. "I'm sorry, I may have misspoken. You see, or rather my son needs help." She shook her head. "And how can I help you?" "I'm not a medical professional, not right now anyway. And children require special treatment. No, I'm not the right person for you." Edward turned dark. The flame of hope was slowly fading, sinking more and more into the abyss of sadness. Suddenly, as if remembering something, the businessman reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. "Here, look. This is my son Volland. He is 7. He can't walk, though he's not disabled, but he really needs help. Maybe you'll do it?" The stranger took the picture carefully, and her hands trembled. "My God, he's so small. Why did he have to go through all this?" Edward could feel her hesitating as she looked at him. In truth, he didn't know the real reason for his choice. It was reckless, to say the least, to invite a man from the street into the house. On the other hand, the way the stranger had rescued the elderly customer deserved respect, for not everyone had such specific skills. "My name is Edward. Don't be afraid, I won't hurt you, and I'll pay you generously for my services. At least give it a try. If it doesn't work out, I won't consider you an enemy or a bad person. You can live in our house. There's plenty of room for everyone." "I don't even think about it," Edward said again. "I'm Stacey Smirnoff." He looked at her hopefully. "So you agree? Am I getting this right?" Stacey smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I do. Where can I get away from you? But I'm not making any promises. After all, I've hardly ever worked with children. But before, I mean. In a previous life." Edward nodded, and then invited her to the car. He didn't feel like shopping today, especially after what had happened at the store. On the way to her employer's house, Stacey behaved modestly, keeping quiet, glancing out the window occasionally. Edward didn't ask any questions, realizing that his new acquaintance needed time to settle in. As she sat in the front seat of the huge SUV, Stacey literally disappeared into it, becoming almost invisible and very small. Edward winked at her and sped up. The businessman drove the car confidently, expertly. Stacey relaxed and drifted off to sleep. Fortunately, it wasn't a long drive, and soon Edward's house was in sight. Or rather, his late wife Vivi's. To be precise, and Edward valued precision above all else. "Here we are. Oh, I forgot to tell you, for the sake of convenience, I'd like to use you without any patronymics and so on. I'm a simple man from the village. It's easier for me," Edward said, pulling the car in front of the house. Stacey nodded in embarrassment and opened the door, leaving the cozy interior of the SUV. It was early fall, and a sharp gust of wind made her body shiver. As the sun set, it was getting quite chilly. The guests' clothes were, to put it mildly, inappropriate for the season. Edward realized that, and headed for the door to go inside, but Stacey was already at the door. "What are you doing out so late? I called you several times, but I couldn't get through." "Oh, we have company." "Oh, I see." Stacey glanced at Edward, but he shrugged to ease the awkwardness. The businessman asked, "Where is my favorite son? Why isn't he meeting his daddy?" Stacey pursed her lips in frustration. And Volland was in a bad mood again. He threw a construction set out the window. "Can you believe it?" That's not true. It wasn't like that at all." My son's voice came from the next room. "What was it like then?" "Tell Daddy don't be shy," Stacey snapped at him. "I didn't throw it away. I shared it with my friends. Their parents didn't have the money to buy one, so I threw it down from the window to the boys in a box. Let them play." "I'm not sorry," Volland objected and left the room in his wheelchair. He shared. How could he? You're such a smart ass. Have you thought how much money that purchase cost your father? When you start earning your own money, then you'll be able to manage your things. But you don't work, Aunt Stacey. But you do manage Daddy's money, Volland said, catching his stepmother off guard. Stacey coughed embarrassedly, signaling that she wasn't enjoying the family squabble. Come on. I'll show you where your room is. Edward caught up and pointed down the long hallway. Volland gave Stacey a wary look and thought, well, another nurse. I bet she'll be on the phone 24 hours a day. Stacey looked at her stepson with hatred, though in truth he had done nothing wrong. In spite of his young age, Volland had already developed his own opinions that were at odds with Stacey's. This often caused friction between the two of them. Only Edward could stop it. Stacey had prepared all sorts of goodies and delicacies for dinner. Stacey, as always, is on top of her game. What's with all this? We're not going to eat it anyway, Edward asked with a smile. I got carried away. It just came out of the blue. You know I like to cook, she said with pride in her voice. At the same time, she threw an angry glance at Volland. The boy obediently lowered his eyes and began picking at his salad with his fork. In fact, he knew very well that Stacey had not cooked anything and had purchased all this culinary splendor at a restaurant, ordering a dozen dishes for home delivery. Volland remembered well the time his stepmother had almost burned down the kitchen when she had tried to make him an omelet. Stacey had ended up handing him a package of instant noodles and recommending that he pour hot water over them. Of course, Edward didn't know about all of this, as his fiancée was very cunning and forward-thinking. Stacey sat silently at dinner, mentally berating herself for accepting the businessman's proposal. Stacey stared at her, unbidden, like a shopper picking things out at the market. What? You don't use that knife? Can't you eat with a fork? She tried to tease her guest. No, it's just more comfortable for me, Stacey said modestly. Stacey grinned, not noticing Volland's judgmental look. Frankly speaking, the boy did not like the behavior of his stepmother, who from the first minutes of their conversation began to pretend to be a queen. She's no better than Stacey herself, he thought. At least the guest is calm and doesn't ask questions like the other aunts who worked in the house. After dinner, everyone went to their rooms. Stacey had one now, though she preferred to go to Volland's room first. Hi, I'm Stacey. You probably already know this, but I'm your new nurse. I'm going to be your nurse from now on. The boy looked at her in disbelief. Just like that. And other aunts immediately tried to cure me, made me do gymnastics, called me lazy. They said I didn't want to help myself. Stacey shook her head sadly. No, why would I try to cure you if you didn't want me to? I'm right. It's easier for you. It's more familiar. Volland's indignation took his breath away. What are you talking about? I really want to, but I can't walk. I believe you. I believe you. But if you don't want to heal yourself, no one can help you get out of that wheelchair. Not even me. And you know everything. That's why you're so smart. You're just a nurse. Aren't you? Volland said uncertainly. But Stacey did not answer the question. She'd gotten the effect of her words, so she could go to bed with a clear conscience. Edward caught up with her at the door to her room, holding a large bag. Here, take it. It's clothes, all new. They're my late wife Vivi's. She never even wore it. I never got around to throwing it away. Don't worry, it's only temporary. You seem to be the same size as her. I knew it right away. But please don't tell Stacey, or she'll be offended. Stacey was embarrassed. Edward suddenly appeared to her in a completely different light. It was as if he'd been standing there in total darkness, and the people around him could only guess at his appearance. Thank you very much. I'll wear them carefully, Stacey murmured softly, taking the bag. Edward went to his office to work on the month's reports. He'd been having a lot of trouble lately, although in the businessman's opinion he couldn't complain. Sitting down at his desk, he looked at Volland's picture in a flowery frame and thought about the times when his son had not had such health problems as he had now. And all this was the result of the trauma he had suffered, not physical but psychological. Edward blamed himself for what had happened. He'd been advised to equip the house with all sorts of sensors and surveillance cameras, hire a couple or 3 guards, finally get a wolfhound with a voice that would make passersby shake. But no, he relied on his good reputation in business circles. A high-profile robbery has put everything in its place, and subsequently led to irreparable consequences. No, Volland, none of the raiders did not offend, but the shock experienced by the boy during the robbery was so strong that his legs failed. Actually, the robbery itself was without casualties. Masked robbers knew perfectly well the location of rooms in the house and the owner's daily routine, so they quickly found the safes in Edward's study. What happened next was a matter of technique. The break-in. the shouts of joy, and the theft of a large sum of money. Little Volland stood in the corner and watched in horror as the black-masked men filled a bag with valuables and money. One of the raiders turned and jokingly threatened the boy with his finger. Volland pressed his back into the wall and covered his eyes with his palms. Schwer's Penelope maid could no longer help and idly watched her master being robbed. After surviving the raid, she quit the next day, leaving Edward alone with his problems. Volland withdrew into himself, lying on his bed for days at a time. The shock he had suffered caused him to develop partial paralysis of his lower limbs. At first, Edward thought that his son's ailment would pass rather quickly. Everyone has unpleasant memories in their lives, and it's okay they walk. If the businessman only knew how wrong he was. It is not surprising when there are so many counselors around, each of whom is so eager to make his own contribution. Don't worry, he'll be fine. The main thing is that the bones are intact, and everything else is not so important. The main thing for a boy is to have the right physique, to be tall and strong, and your Volland will be just like that. You'll see, you mark my word, Jonathan said. Edward nodded in agreement, trying to find the strength to believe what was causing him the greatest fear. Edward was used to being treated with condescension in business circles. It was as if the gods had come down from Olympus to bless a mere mortal. They say that he has made his way into the elite. Well done. It was about time he showed zeal. Edward knew that many envied him. A rich widower who got $1 million after his wife died in his will. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And Edward had taken it. He grabbed it by the tail, much to the dismay of the others. Virtually no one doubted that it was a marriage of convenience. What else could it be? When you marry the daughter of Jacob's richest man. But Edward himself was not a wealthy man. He married Vivi for love alone. And so that no one would think the guy had fallen for his rich bride's assets, he'd even agreed to sign a prenup. That's the right thing to do. That's the way it's done in our circle. No offense. No, but if the marriage is equal, it's different, you know. Everything is equal. You're not a Rothschild, Jacob said. Edward didn't take offense, he understood, and he didn't expect any different treatment. To everyone, he was just another capital hunter for his rich bride, a puppet in the hands of his father-in-law, who played his son-in-law like an experienced puppeteer. No one could even think that Edward cared about Vivi, not her dowry in a foreign bank, cars, luxury homes, and all the other tinsel that the rich of all ranks and colors so often bragged about. Unfortunately, in marriage they lived only 2 years, although before that they met for 3. And all because the father of the bride deliberately delayed the wedding, expecting that the young parted, and the problem will solve itself. What do I need this poor man for? Whose son is he? The tractor driver's son. His mother is unemployed. What kind of status is that? A housewife. What can she do for a housewife? Tip the cow's tails, Jacob was talking to his wife, who was Vivi's stepmother. Trixie looked at her husband ironically. She didn't want to judge Edward, nor did she want to get into an argument with him, so she preferred to stay neutral. It was better for herself and the people around her. At the time of the wedding, Edward was working as a management trainee in Jacob's office. He wasn't exactly a star in the sky. How could he? When he'd graduated from university only 6 months ago, and by correspondence, since he'd been working as a longshoreman to keep from starving in a city so foreign and hostile to him. No one could have guessed that it wouldn't be long before Edward would be the first violinist in the company. Oh, son, you seem to be making a big mistake. They'll ruin you, the rich people. Nothing is sacred to them. I can see the way they look at you. You're just a servant to them, Edward's mother said bitterly. But the boy did not give up and accepted all the trials with the proper humility, signed a marriage contract, according to which in case of divorce he received nothing. But Edward did not despair. He sincerely loved his wife, and when she gave him Volland, he began to love even more. The birth of his grandson melted the ice in Jacob's heart. His heartfelt conversations with his son-in-law were more and more often accompanied by warm notes. It was still a long way from complete harmony, but Edward didn't want it. Then Jacob's family was haunted by an evil fate. First, Jacob, the head of the company, fell gravely ill. Neither money, nor doctors, nor elite private clinics helped. Many said at the time that this was payback for the years of frenzied accumulation of initial capital, writer takeovers, not so legal schemes, and now the unshakable colossus had fallen, approaching ordinary mortals at arm's length. Deep down, Edward sympathized with his father-in-law and held no grudge. What was there to be angry about when he was the kind of man who couldn't be changed? Jacob was fading before his eyes. There was nothing the family could do. No folk healer, no fortune tellers, no expensive drugs from abroad helped. Trixie's wife stayed with him every step of the way, trying to ease his condition. But it was all in vain. Jacob was gone. 3 days before his 50th birthday, standing at his father-in-law's fresh grave, Edward didn't know that it would only be a year before the same fate would befall his wife. Her life had been cut short by bilateral pneumonia. It was freezing cold when she went skiing with her friends. Vivi always watched her figure and liked to give her body physical activity. That fateful day, Edward tried to dissuade her. Maybe another time would be better, Vivi. Really, such a drastic change. Yesterday it was 0, and today it's almost -20. But his wife immediately reassured him. Don't worry, Edward, everything will be fine. It's not the first time I've done this. We have to seize the moment or summer will come. And then what? You know you have to act while you can. Well, you know best, of course. Just please be careful. Vivi hugged her husband lovingly. I promise Penelope and I won't be long. We'll do a couple laps and then back. If only Edward had known where his wife's innocent amusement would lead. He would never have let her leave the house. That fateful morning, the three of them drove out of town in Vivi's car. The weather was clear and frosty, and there was no sign of trouble. But as soon as the car hit the bridge, the worst happened. Vivi had been distracted for a split second while answering a friend's question, which made her too late to notice the SUV crossing into the oncoming traffic lane. In an attempt to avoid the collision, Penelope swerved the steering wheel to the left and rammed into the bridge supports. The car plummeted into the ice-filled river. The impact was so strong that the mangled body of the car broke through the ice and plunged into the water about half. From afar, the car looked like a float that had lost its integrity and was filling with water. It was slowly going down. Penelope and Vivi began to scream loudly, smashing their palms against the windows. No one wanted to die at that age. Vivi was the first to come to her senses and, unlike her friends, began to squeeze out the windshield because there was a huge crack in it. When she succeeded, there was icy water under her feet. Looking at her friends, Vivi commanded, "Come on, what's the holdup? Hurry up before the car drowns." "Yes, of course," now Penelope whispered, shivering from the cold, and began to climb to the saving edge of the ice. Vivi followed. Vivi was the last to leave the sinking car, like a shipwrecked captain. Unfortunately, at that moment her clothes were soaked through and her body was already pierced by cold needles. Although the ambulance arrived relatively quickly, Vivi suffered severe frostbite, which later gave complications to her lungs. The doctors did everything they could, but medicine was powerless in such cases. With a high fever, Vivi was thrashing around in delirium and begged for a notary to be brought to her. "Honey, you don't have to. Why are you thinking about it? You're going to get better," Edward begged her. He sincerely believed this, because he rightly believed that money could do anything in a certain situation. God, but it's not cancer. "Aren't there any more effective drugs?" Edward asked the head of the department, but he just shook his head. Vivi could feel herself fading away, and with each breath the life was slowly leaving her disease-ridden body. "Sweet Edward, I'm so sorry about this. Don't worry, I took care of everything. You and Volland won't need anything," Vivi wheezed, gathering the rest of her strength. "Oh, come on, what are you talking about? You're going to be fine. Do you hear me? I'll raise everyone's ears. We'll find a way out," Edward whispered without noticing the tears on his cheeks. But somewhere upstairs in heaven, the decision had already been made. Kneeling in front of his wife's bed, the young widower covered his face with his hands and sobbed. But why should he have all these cursed riches when his beloved is gone, and his heart is torn with pain? At the sight of this sad picture, the nurses turned pale and hurriedly passed by, and an elderly nurse even crossed herself as she came closer. "You cry, dear man. Some of the pain will come out with your tears, but don't give up. Live in such a way that your spouse will be proud of you. She's up there in heaven, seeing everything." Edward looked longingly at the nurse. "Thank you. But you don't need to comfort me. It still hurts a lot." She touched his arm sympathetically. "It hurts. Honey, do you have children?" "I do." "Then live for them. Children are our future. They are called the flowers of life for a reason. Only flowers bloom for one season, but babies, if you take care of them, are happy for a long time." To Edward's amazement, the elderly nurse's words had a favorable effect on him. There was something in them that made him pull himself together and think of his son, who was still so young that he didn't understand anything. The funeral and all the subsequent mourning took place like a dream for Edward. At the cemetery, standing by the fresh grave, the young widower realized that the rich cried too, but in their own way. But is he rich? It's not all his. The firm company shares elite real estate. And who is he? The son of a tractor driver from the village, who decided to try his luck in the big city. But his happiness was short-lived, and the price for it had to pay the highest, one that makes your head spin and your heart ache. Maybe it was all just a dream. Edward had to pinch his shoulder and everything would be back to normal. The village, the birds singing in the morning, and the smell of freshly cut grass. Water from the well, you drink it like nectar, but the cold makes your teeth chatter. But there was no smell of sleep here. All this was a harsh reality to the point of impossibility. At first, no one saw Edward as the heir to a vast empire. Everyone expected him to make a rash move, and like a house of cards, the whole thing would collapse. And if it did, they'd help him fall anyway. Sooner or later, there would be someone to push him, as they say. But Edward not only held on, but also managed to prove that he was worthy of more than the representatives of the business elite gave him. The widower had to go through a lot before his name and surname became indicators of wealth and success. And while everything was going relatively well in business, in his family, on the contrary, problem after problem followed him like an avalanche. I can handle it, as long as Stacey is right for Volland. The meeting seemed to go well, but don't get too excited, Edward whispered, pushing aside a disturbing memory. At the same time, Stacey was lying in bed, thinking about her future. I wonder when Edward will propose to me. Or does he think I'll be his mistress forever? No, not yet, darling, you won't. That's not why I put up with your crazy son. Edward didn't know all of this, of course, and continued to naively believe that Stacey loved him as much as he had loved Vivi. The next morning after breakfast, Stacey walked into Volland's room. So, little one, ready to go for a walk with me? Volland looked at the nurse incredulously to see if she was joking. Those who had gone before her were afraid of walks like fire. It was understandable. If something happened to the boy, who would be responsible? But Stacey persisted. What's up, Volland? Are you going or not? The weather's really nice today. Golden fall. We're going to collect leaves for the herbarium. What herbarium? The boy asked in surprise. Well, what kind of herbarium? For school crafts applications, we'll collect fallen leaves with you. And then we'll take a thick book and put the leaves between the pages. That's what I used to do with my mom, Stacey explained calmly. Wow, that's cool. Can we go to the pond too? They say there are lots of swans and wild ducks there. Stacey smiled. We can, of course. Not only is there a pond with swans and geese, but there are squirrels there too. They're very tame. If you give them a piece of breadcrumbs or a bagel, they'll take it right out of the palm of your hand. Volland's eyes became genuinely interested. The boy also looked at the nurse with respect. Stacey treated him like a normal, full-fledged child. No pity, no sugary sweet sympathy paid for out of Daddy's voluminous wallet. Stacey helped Volland dress and rolled the stroller to the exit. Edward wasn't home, as he had gotten up at the crack of dawn, as usual, in a hurry to get to the office. Stacey called out to them at the door. Where do you think you're going? All dressed up and pretty. We're going to the park to get some fresh air, Stacey replied. To the park? Why don't you stay home? The baby's little, and he's sick. What if he gets worse? And who's going to be responsible for that? Are you going to be responsible? Stacey was indignant. She hadn't really cared about Volland for a long time. The point was different. Stacey had a sudden urge to show her power in the house, to let this girl know who was the boss of the house. Stacey looked sadly at Volland, but the boy didn't want to give up. I can call Daddy if you want and ask permission. But then I'll also tell him about how we got a delicious dinner on the table last night, and I'll remind him about the burnt eggs too. Stacey's face flushed with anger. Okay, he wants to be bossy, that little handicapped kid. On the other hand, Stacey didn't want Edward to see her weaknesses. She'd never been a friend of the kitchen, and not only didn't like cooking, she didn't know how to cook. All right, go ahead. Just be careful out there and don't linger near the water. It's not summer. Stacey gritted her teeth. Volland looked at Stacey with a smile and winked. You know what you're doing, Auntie. It was a lovely walk. Stacey showed Volland the most beautiful places in the park, which she knew like the back of her hand. So they first fed the swans and ducks with bread. Then Volland played with the squirrels. Looking at the boy's joyful face, Penelope could not hold back her tears. And maybe this is happiness. The very thing about which so much has been said, a child's laughter. Is it possible to replace it with something of equal importance? Hardly. Hardly. Are we going to the park tomorrow? Volland asked. These words immediately brought her out of her agonized reverie. We shall, of course, if it doesn't rain. You and I haven't collected any leaves today. When I was little, we had a task for the summer at school, to collect and dry leaves, and in the fall to prepare cones and chestnuts. And then we made crafts during labor lessons. Hedgehogs, different animals. Wow, interesting. And I'm not going to school until next year. That's what Daddy decided. But Aunt Stacey's against it. She says, I'll have half a day of peace and quiet without you. Hey, Auntie, How do you know the park so well? Volland asked. The boy's question struck a nerve. It seemed to be a commonplace curiosity, but it was as if a black cat had run through his heart. I've spent a lot of time here, Volland. First as a student, when I was at university, and then as an adult. I used to come here. Volland looked at Stacey in surprise. I thought you didn't have to study to be a hobo. Well, I've seen in movies that the street teaches them. They also sleep in basements and beg for money all the time. But you're not like that. You are special. Penelope looked at the boy with undisguised amazement, still not knowing whether to laugh or be upset. Volland had quickly labeled her a tramp. Oh my God, it was so obvious, and Edward, did he think she was a homeless beggar? Realizing the awkwardness of her own situation, Stacey had to tell the truth. I'm not a tramp, Volland, and I don't live in a basement. But that's understandable. You're in the room next door now, the kid objected. Stacey shook her hands. Oh, you know everything. I wasn't always like this. I used to be an EMT, just so you know. Just like Dr. Ebelet, Volland persisted. Yes, just like that. I used to go on calls, treat people, and in my spare time I walked in the park. I didn't write poems, but I did it for my soul. Volland looked at her respectfully. She was a good woman. That Aunt Stacey's such a lady, and a doctor. She can write poetry, and she knows a lot of things. And then what happened? The curious boy asked again. Stacey turned pale and furtively brushed away a tear. I'm sorry, buddy. Let's do it another time. Okay? It's a very grown-up story. You'll think it's not for children's ears. Just don't tell Daddy about it. It's unnecessary. Volland nodded peacefully. Why offend such a kind aunt? When Volland returned home, the first thing he did was to tell his father about the walk. Edward couldn't believe his eyes when he looked at his joyful son. He hadn't seen Volland this happy in a long time. Stacey, you're magic. I don't know what I would do without you, Edward said with feeling. Stacey looked at the nurse with hatred. If she had her way, that girl would be out of their house in no time. And this wasn't a house. Volland would have gone to a boarding school for children with disabilities. He's so proud of his master's praise. Stacey's cheeks turned pink, and a slight smile played on her lips. Volland wanted to tell the story he had heard in the park, but then hesitated half a word, remembering his promise. Stacey's lips drew together in a solid line with anger. Well, we'll see whose side it is, she said, a stray thought running through her head. Edward thanked his fiancée for dinner and went to his office. His competitors had been too active lately. Everything they did was in color, as if they knew all his moves ahead of time. But how is it possible? Is there a traitor in the ranks of the company's employees? And why not? You know, you have a lot of envious people. Everyone thinks you're lucky. You just got married, and your wife died right away. Forgive me for saying so, but there's no such thing as coincidence. It's like your son-in-law was waiting for him to show up so he could give his soul to God, Jonathan said. Edward always reacted violently to such statements. What are you doing? Are you out of your mind? I love Vivi, and I wasn't even thinking about her wealth. You may not believe me, but I was against the inheritance in the first place. I would have left it to Volland or some distant relative. Jonathan only shook his head and grinned. Oh, come on, don't be such a Robin Hood either. He didn't want money. Who doesn't think about money nowadays, especially the kind that falls from the sky right into your hands? Edward almost punched his companion in the face that time. He's not a nice guy, Jonathan. Only money, money, and more money, as if there was nothing else in life but money. Stacey, on the other hand, was thinking about something else. How could she help Volland get out of his wheelchair? How could she get the boy to stop focusing on his illness? What if she tried it like this? Okay, that's tomorrow. Today didn't seem likely to work. I'll get up early in the morning. I'll get it right before Volland wakes up, Stacey whispered with a smile and went to bed. She liked living with Edward's family, especially if she ignored the negativity of her landlady. Stacey could understand it, though. The businessman's fiancée was afraid that the nurse might come to the forefront and overshadow her, the prissy prima donna. But Stacey looked at it with unconcealed irony. How could she possibly compete with Stacey? It's ridiculous. A woman who had lost everything in her life and a hottie who spent her time in beauty parlors and restaurants. The next morning, Stacey got up before everyone else and quietly slipped out of the house. She headed for a place to buy a puppy, a stray. Of course, Stacey knew there was a small, spontaneous market near the train station where retired grandmothers sold herbs from their gardens. Craftsmen were selling products of their talent, and artists were selling all sorts of junk to the suffering. In the midst of this motley mass stood a man with a huge cardboard TV box. The bottom of the box was lined with a soft cloth to make the puppy sitting there more comfortable. The idea was that for a price, anyone could bring a puppy and leave it with the vendor. Situations could be very different. For example, a person found a foundling among garbage cans but could not take it home. What do you know? Maybe the living space does not allow it, or he is allergic to animals, but the puppy needs to be adopted. You can't just leave him starving on the street. A shelter is a good thing, but it's not a rubber band either. There's not enough room for everyone. That's why there was a little man with a box at the market. He takes the puppies and then sells them to anyone who wants them for a symbolic 5 cents. And the demand is there because the puppies are always fed clean and clean. How can you pass by such little puppies? Of course, even for the symbolic price of selling puppies, the peddler was in a constant loss. But the emotions of being able to place a baby in a new family did not compare to the temporary inconvenience and expense of keeping foster pets. Seeing this, the man smiled happily. "Oh, Stacey's here," he said. "Oh, come on, come on. It's nothing. What do you care about Stacey?" "That's all in the past. I'm just Stacey now," the woman replied. Emmett nodded in agreement, but still remarked, "You'll always be Stacey to me, an ambulance station paramedic. If it weren't for that unfortunate incident, you and I would still be on call today." Stacey frowned. "Not bringing up the past isn't necessary at all. I remember everything perfectly well as it is. I mean, you were the best orderly on my shift, and what happened back then was my fault, and no one else's. I got you fired, and you warned me. You saw the driver of that foreign car dying, and I went in anyway. I gave him a shot, and the patient was allergic to the drug. He was doomed anyway. That's what the board proved. After the autopsy, they found a lot of alcohol in that businessman's blood. Thank God no one was hurt." Emmett turned pale and clenched his fists painfully. "What do you mean no one was hurt? What about you and me? We got kicked out with a wolf's license. We had to stop practicing medicine. It was a high-profile case. The father of the victim was a big shot, so they put us on trial. They wanted to charge us with criminal negligence. And what was the negligence? That the poor guy had half a minute to live. We took a chance and tried to save him. Thanks to the judge and the lawyer, he was a good one. We avoided a felony." Stacey looked into the former orderly's eyes and saw tears in them. "Oh, Emmett, you're worthless," she said quietly. She thought sadly, but did not pursue the unpleasant topic further. "All right, enough already. We've talked about it 100 times. I'm sick of it myself. I'm actually here on business. I'd like more, Oberyn." The former orderly raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Is that what I thought it was? Can I congratulate you, Stacey?" "No," the woman smiled. "You know, I got pregnant after all these events, and I can't have any more children. That's why my husband left me. He went to a young woman, filed for divorce. He's got the house for himself. I have nothing left. Anyway, I'm homeless now. But it doesn't matter. Show me the puppy." Emmett sighed heavily and began to show his former colleague the babies he had in stock today. After a moment's hesitation, Stacey decided on a snow-white pup with black ears and tail. Looking at him, it looked like someone had intentionally painted over those body parts to make adjustments to his appearance. "Good choice. But I warn you at once, he will grow up big. He has in his relatives either a Labrador or an Alibi. So take that into account," Emmett said. "See how big his foot is? Only giants have those." Stacey smiled and gave her former co-worker everything she had in her pocket. Emmett tried to refuse and return the money, but it was all in vain. "Goodbye. I'll drop by again. I'm sorry I'm late for work." The nurse is looking after the boy, but not for long. Emmett looked at his former boss and turned his attention back to the babies in the box. When Stacey entered the room with a white puppy in her arms, Volland's joy knew no bounds. "Wow, what a handsome boy. Can we call him Snowball?" Stacey smilingly handed the baby to Volland. "Of course you can. Especially since he's as white as snow. But you brought a dog into the house. You should at least ask before you make such decisions. Is he even vaccinated? What if he's got fleas or shingles or rabies? What then?" Stacey came into the living room. "Oh, come on. He's a normal puppy. A friend of mine gave him to me. He is mostly mongrels, but they're all vaccinated. He brings the vet in once a week," said Stacey. "Look, this is a real game changer. A mongrel, and he's vaccinated. It's like nothing I've ever seen in the house before," Stacey exclaimed. Edward came into the living room, as Edward was getting ready for work. What's all the commotion? We must have a new tenant. What's his name? Snowball. Daddy, can I keep it? Volland begged. Father smiled. Oh, you can, my friend, no problem. Why not? I even like the name, and the dog's a good dog. When Stacey heard his answer, she almost choked with anger. But she didn't resist. She went to her room. Voldemort put the baby on his lap and rode him around the room in his stroller. Stacey looked at Edward with a smile, and he nodded approvingly. In his opinion, the nurse was definitely doing a solid A, maybe even an A+. On the way to work, Edward thought about the situation in his office. The thing was, he had made a very serious and reliably legal enemy. For the same reason, most of the deals he had made had failed, but the worst of it was that the information about future contracts was stored in Edward's personal safe, the same one that had been robbed not too long ago. Of course, the lock on the safe had been replaced with a newer and better one, but the fact remained. The information on his latest deal could have been leaked by someone either in the household or very close to him. But who? Could it have been Stacey? And how? How could she have gotten the code to the safe? Edward's mood dropped noticeably. There was obviously something wrong with this nurse. Why wouldn't she tell me anything about her past? What if she was the mole? The timing and her strange behavior all matched. At that moment, a very interesting thought occurred to Edward. What if he installed hidden surveillance cameras in the house, but only secretly, so that no one would know about them, not even Volland? No, he is not a mole, of course, but because of his age, he can easily give away everything he knows. The businessman liked the idea so much that instead of the office, he went to a large electronics store. The salesman patiently listened to him and then pointed to one of the models. Here, pay attention to this model. On the plus side, it has a fairly long battery life. The recording itself can be streamed in real time directly to your phone. Storage to Penelope by choice, you can upload to the internet, and you can upload to an internal drive. Installation is very simple, does not require any special skills for installation at all. Edward smiled contentedly. Oh, that suits me just fine. But I'd like to keep this purchase a secret. The salesman nodded understandingly, not forgetting to mention that their firm practiced complete confidentiality. It took Edward about an hour to install the cameras. The businessman was lucky, because that was when Volland had gone for a walk with Stacey and the puppy to the city park. And Stacey had already been in the beauty parlor for the last hour to get even more effect from her unruly curls. Well, let's see what kind of fish I've got in my net, Edward thought with a smile. In case the cameras didn't work, he intended to install them in the office for the same purpose as at home. The wait was about 3 days. At first, there was nothing interesting on the tapes. The tenants behaved in the same way as before. Life went on as before. No special secrets or unexplored discoveries. But what Edward saw on the tape of the third day shocked him. He could not believe his eyes. The surprise was so intense that he was speechless for a while. The fact was that his son Volland, left at home alone, had been walking quietly about the rooms. So his traveling in a wheelchair was a deception. Unable to contain his emotions, Edward headed for his son's room. Seeing Stacey there with the puppy, he motioned for the nurse to come out. Dad, why are you doing this? Don't send Stacey away. I'm only going to talk to her, the boy begged, pale as a sheet. His father looked at the nurse and waved his hand. Fine, let her stay. I have no secrets from her. Especially not a secret that it's you that's keeping us. Volland looked fearfully at Stacey, but she smiled and shifted her gaze to Edward. I apologize for switching to you again, but I have a rough guess at what this conversation is about. And what do you think it's about? Edward asked ironically. Stacey deliberately paused for a moment, then said, it's going to be about the fact that your son isn't sick at all and has been moving around like a healthy man for the past 6 months. And how do you know that? It's not like I've told anyone about it, Volland exclaimed. Stacey smiled. I noticed it from the house slippers, buddy. Whenever there were no adults in the house, they somehow changed their position. Volland sighed sadly, and after some hesitation rose from his wheelchair, taking a few steps around the room. Edward watched his son without looking away, still not believing what was happening. Finally, realizing that all this was indeed reality and not a dream, he still asked Volland, why? What's the point? This has all been going on for months now. Stacey immediately touched his shoulder, hinting that the child needed to be spoken to more gently. Tears ran down Volland's cheeks. This is all because of Stacey. Dad, you've been paying so much attention to her lately that if I even got out of the stroller, you'd completely forget about me. I really couldn't walk at first. And then when I got better, I started pretending. So you take care of me like you used to. Edward's heart trembled. Hugging his son, he lifted him easily into his arms and spun him around the room. Stacey stood back and smiled. She had discovered Volland's deception almost immediately, but she wouldn't reveal the little boy's secret. Let him decide when it was better to come out of the shadows and appear before everyone in a new image. "But then who was examining the documents in my safe?" Edward asked anxiously. Stacey shrugged her shoulders in confusion. Volland, on the other hand, had his suspicions. "Dad, it's Stacey one day. When she thought everyone was asleep, I snuck into your office. The light was on, but you weren't at your desk." "And what happened next?" Father asked eagerly. Volland hesitated for a moment and then, gathering his wits, said Stacey was in the study. She opened the safe somehow. She was also talking to some man on a video link. "What was his name?" "Hector. Gosh, some really weird name there. I can't remember. Maybe Jonathan." "Are you sure of your own guess?" Edward asked. "Ah, that's right. Jonathan. Jonathan for sure." Edward sank down in his chair with a groan. "What is this?" "There are traitors everywhere. Stacey, Jonathan. But what could possibly connect them?" That same day, Edward gave his fiancée a thorough interrogation. At first she'd refused, made a surprised face. But when Volland rode into the room in a wheelchair and rose from it in a spectacular manner, she gave up and waved her hand. "It's all your late father-in-law's fault. Edward, Ben actually happens to be my biological father. For a while in his turbulent youth, he lived on 2 families, and as a result, he had 2 daughters, one legitimate, Vivi, and the other like me, a gray mouse born into a sinful relationship. When my father died, not a muscle in my face quivered. 2 years earlier, I had buried my mother. She had drunk herself to death because of that lustful bugger, but justice was served. I've waited all these years for a reason. Vivi, my sister, went to the grave right after her father. I was getting ready to gather documents to prove my kinship when I found out that that fool had bequeathed all the money from the Semyonov family to you, to that fool Yemela from the village." Edward's cheeks flared, but he held back. Stacey continued, "You've been sitting on the stove for years, and you would have been for years if it hadn't been for that fool. You should have left everything to your husband. You're a country bumpkin, look at you. You stink of dung a mile away. Stop hurting my father, you bastard." Volland couldn't help himself. And Stacey spoke up, "No, no, no. I told Jonathan to come up with something original. He's a fool. He's trying to ruin you. Because Edward's inheritance was a windfall. He took it by surprise. You should share it. It was his men who robbed you 2 years ago. You don't believe me? How do you think they got a detailed plan of the rooms in the house? They took a lot of money, but you got out of it. You got the insurance. You're lucky." Edward. Stacey snarled and headed for the exit. No one was going to stop her. What was the point? There was nothing to convict her of anyway. There was no evidence on hand, and a little boy's words were not going to stick. Edward sighed and walked over to Penelope and Volland, then hugged them both. Birds were singing to the businessman's heart that he had identified his enemies, and the black streak in his life was finally coming to an end. It was all the fault of money and envy. Jonathan was detained the very next day. Out of resentment and deep disappointment in her hapless lover, Stacey promised to testify against him. Edward had a new life, and Penelope took a special place in it. However, she was not a housewife for long, and with the support of her husband opened a shelter for homeless animals. Victor became the manager of the shelter. Now people brought puppies not to the market, but directly to the shelter, where there were all the conditions for their living. They gave the puppies into good hands. Victor, as he used to do, asked for a penny for food, but not for profit, but for the memory of the past, when he used this change, along with part of his earnings, to buy food and medicines for the babies. As Victor had promised, Snowball eventually grew to the size of a calf and could easily knock a grown man off his feet. Volland went to school and brings home only good grades. At the same time, he calls Penelope mom and stands up for her. He also brags to his friends that soon he will have a brother. Whether this is true or not, it is difficult to say, but judging by the noticeably rounded tummy Penelope, the words of the boy is not meaningless. "Mommy, look what a boat Grandpa made for me," Vivian exclaimed as soon as she saw it. It was early spring outside. The snow had just begun to melt, but all the puddles had already turned into streams, around which the children were running merrily, shouting and laughing. Everyone had paper boats, and some of them had real wooden boats made by their fathers or grandfathers on the weekend. Near a large tree, from which large drops of melting snow were falling, stood a girl of 8, tall for her age. She looked longingly in front of her. She didn't have a boat. Her mom was at work, so she couldn't make one. And the girl had no one else, not even friends. They had recently moved to a new house, and she had not yet had time to get acquainted with anyone, but she liked to go out. But it was hard to have fun when everyone was playing and laughing and no one wanted you. Lily sighed and pouted her lips in resentment. On a bench a little away from the brooks and trees sat a short old man with gray tangled hair and a gray-brown cotton jacket. On his feet were very shabby boots that must have been cold. He looked at the children with a smile, then shifted his gaze to the girl and lowered his head sadly. After a few seconds, some idea occurred to the old man. He jumped up from the bench and ran somewhere towards the house. He knocked on the door. A rather tall woman came out on the porch with a vacuum cleaner in her hands. She asked the old man something menacingly, but when he explained what he wanted, she nodded her head and went into the house. A few seconds later, she returned with a piece of paper. The old man nodded gratefully and returned to his bench. He began to fold the paper into something that looked like a ship. He did it in a very unusual way, in his own way, and even managed to attract the girl's attention. It should be recognized that this old man was one of those who, with his kindness and charm, could make people to himself. He was helped by everyone to whom he turned for help. Either he managed to pity them, or he was able to choose those who were able to sympathize. Nobody knew such people who would not refuse help, but everyone helped, and he never said no when he was asked. Maggie Swan, who lived in a house on the edge of the street, was an old and feeble old woman. She was so weak that sometimes she couldn't carry heavy bags home. Stephen, the old man, was always there to help. Maggie Swan often brought cutlets or soup to his home, an abandoned schoolhouse. Lillian watched the old man with interest as he folded the ship. When he finally finished, he smiled kindly at the girl and beckoned her over to him. Lillian's mom always told her not to go near strangers because they could hurt her, or take her away from her mom. And Lillian had always obeyed her mother's command. But not now. The old man's good-natured smile, curiosity, and desire to play with everyone made her go to the bench. The old man silently handed the girl a small snow-white ship made of thick paper, almost cardboard. It was unusual, not like the others, big, with sails and masts. Lillian did not know that such a thing could be made from an ordinary sheet of paper. Her eyes lit up, and she looked at the old man, as if he were a wizard from a fairy tale she had recently read. The old man nodded at the creek where the children were playing and smiled again. The smile lit up Lillian's face. She ran to play with the others, as if this ship was a ticket to a world of friendship and children's games. Contrary to her wish, the girl did not put the ship on the water and began to feel sorry for it. She ran with the boys, refused to exchange with the boys who offered their crafts. What Lillian got was attention and a desire to play with her. She didn't need anything else. She turned to see that old man again, but he wasn't there. The bench was empty. Lillian looked sadly at the ship and ran home. She would be sure to keep it. No other way, for it was a gift from a real wizard. At home, Lily waited impatiently for her mother. She had to come home from work in the evening, about 5 o'clock. The girl was so impatient to tell about the ship that she forgot to eat and did not even turn on her favorite cartoons, which were only on Saturdays and only at this time. She kept running to the window to see her mother's red coat or her blue beret. But Mom was lingering somewhere. When the hand of the clock passed 5, Lily began to worry. She didn't move away from the window anymore. Tears almost came to her eyes. What if Mommy, like Daddy once, didn't come? The girl was afraid that it would happen again. But fortunately, this time her fears were in vain. Lily's mom, Vivian, came half an hour after the promised time. Lily threw herself on her neck, not even allowing her to put the bags on the floor. "What's wrong?" Vivian exclaimed. "I thought you weren't coming as Daddy," almost sobbed the girl. Sweet Vivian hugged her daughter and squatted down. Lily, like most children, was often dramatic, but it was enough to caress her, and her resentments usually ended after a series of favorite cartoons, or after a batch of ice cream bought especially for her. Now she wiped away her tears with her sleeve and smiled broadly. "Look what I have," shouted the girl and ran off to her room. Vivian smiled and shook her head, trying to get her boots off before her daughter arrived. Lily came running in just a few seconds later and held out a snow-white ship to her mother. Vivian took it in her hands and bowed her head. She examined it closely and came across a faded, barely legible inscription. The woman aghast and drew back, not knowing what to say. "Honey, where did you get it?" The old man on the bench Lily shrugged. "He made it for me." "What did he look like?" Lily wondered. She wasn't good at describing people, so she could only name clothes. Vivian handed her daughter the grocery bags and asked her to sort through them, and went to her room. She sat down tiredly on her bed and sighed. The woman couldn't believe her eyes and still thought she had only imagined it. Vivian reached into her locker and pulled out an old shoebox from there. She carefully removed the lid with trembling fingers and exhaled noisily. Rarely did she have to open this cherished box. For years, it had been filled with old trinkets that anyone else would have called junk when they opened a shoebox. But for Vivian, it was the only thing that connected her to her parents. Or rather, so she thought. Vivian Laurel's mom was indeed dead. She had died of cancer when the girl was 13. Her father, on the other hand, had gone missing 3 years earlier. At the age of 13, Vivian was left alone. The boon of her upbringing was taken by an aunt, her father's sister, Helen. She was younger than her brother, unmarried, and belonged to the type of people who believed that nothing could be better than freedom. So she never restricted her niece in anything. However, her upbringing, too. She was not particularly engaged, preferring to write memoirs, go to modeling shoots and celebrate contracts with her many lovers, which she had at least 6 for the time that Vivian lived with her. Except the last one had lingered for 2 years with her son Damien. Ellen had never treated her niece with warmth or anything of the sort. She simply didn't care for the girl. At times she would walk into her room, look at Vivian aloofly, nod her thoughts, and leave. At the age of 18, she subtly began to hint that it was time for her niece to do the honors, and that she was too busy in someone else's house. From then on, Vivian started living on her own. She had been working part-time before, saving money for the future, and now she began to live on her own. 16 years ago, a 13-year-old girl named Vivian sat on a narrow bed with flowered sheets. She was holding a ship made of paper. It had a mast and sails, and was not like the ones the children played with on the street. The girl's face was streaked with tears. She looked sadly at the ship. Her hand trembled. "And what did you get me wrong with this toy?" "Aren't you 5 years old?" Rolling her eyes, she asked Ellen, who leaned against the door and looked at her niece. She was a tall, thin woman with long curly hair and a very pretty face. The woman preferred to wear expensive brand-name clothes and wore good makeup. As a child, Vivian often heard from her mother that she didn't know where she got the money for all this, because Ellen never had a proper job. Once in a while, she sold her graphomaniacal writings to publishing houses and received modest money for photo shoots as a model. "Daddy made this for me," the girl replied, coping with her emotions, and hid the ship in a small shoebox that stood beside her. When the lid was in place, Vivian clutched the box to her chest. "Your father has been gone for 3 years. No? There's no telling where he is," Ellen shrugged. "It's about time you started living your own life. Your mother wasn't very good at it, though." Vivian looked at her aunt with hatred and clenched her teeth. A storm of emotions rose up in her over the mention of her mother in such a negative way. The girl understood that she should not quarrel with her aunt, with whom she would have to live for a long time. But she was not going to listen to such statements about her mother. "It's a memory of him. Only he made ships like this. I know, because no one else had them. He used to leave his signature by folding the sheet in a special way. Would you like me to show you?" Ellen held up her hands, shook her head. Looking at old paper always made me ache. When he had nothing else to do, he also stuck it to others. The look Vivian gave her aunt frightened the woman. She opted to remove herself from the small room, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. There could be no mistake. It was indeed the same ship. The same illegible letters were folded and stamped on the side as on the old, yellowed pieces of paper. Vivian folded the 2 ships and closed her eyes. "What if I'm just making this up to myself?" The woman shook her head. Nothing had been heard from her father in over 19 years. It was as if he had fallen through the earth. And now, after all this time, Vivian sees the same ship. What if it was just a coincidence? But she didn't believe in coincidence. Vivian believed in fate. Maybe it was her desire to have at least one loving relative. Except for her daughter, of course. but she was too young to confide her worries to her. Vivian had never been an optimist. Quite the opposite. Life didn't give her moments to believe in miracles or happy endings. First her father disappeared, then her mother died. A self-obsessed aunt became her guardian. At 19, it seemed that life was finally starting to get better. When the young girl was in law school, she got a boyfriend and they started living together. It seemed then that it would always be good. But fate never left Vivian. They just gave her a little respite. And then years later, there was grief in her life again. The usual, ordinary grief. The woman was glad to have her daughter, but she was very afraid for her. In essence, Lily was all Vivian had left. And the tiny chance that her father was still alive lit a faint flame in the long-lost woman's soul. "Lily," Vivian shouted, putting the box away. She had never shown it to anyone since that day at Ellen's house. It seemed to be something private and intimate, something to be hidden and given to no one. "Honey, come here." Lily ran into the room. Her face was smeared with flour. It certainly didn't escape her mother's attentive gaze. Vivian looked at her daughter with that maternal look that made it impossible to lie. Lowering her eyes, Lillian confessed. "I dropped the flour. The whole packet. I meant to make cheesecakes this morning, but I remembered too late. I thought I'd have it cleaned up before you got here." "Kids," Vivian thought and shook her head. For a second, the heavy thoughts were gone from her head and she looked at her daughter with a smile. Lily was the only ray of light in her life, and she wasn't ready to lose it. "Okay, we'll deal with the flour," Vivian said. "You'd better tell me, where was the old man who made you the boat?" Lillian sighed and tried to explain the place. Vivian had grown up in this town, so she knew the streets and nooks and crannies very well. However, even she had a hard time figuring out the location from her daughter's clumsy and slightly awkward description. "The garages are near the village?" Vivian shrieked when she finally understood. Lillian shrugged her shoulders. "If it's not them, I've completely forgotten the town." Lily didn't understand half of her mother's words, so she just nodded and pulled her by the hand into the kitchen. "Come on, I'm hungry." "Oh, you'll be hungry all day. I want rice with a cutlet." The girl nodded and rushed into the kitchen. "But first, let's remove the flour." Vivian grinned. A heavy sigh sounded on a cool spring street near a small village. It wasn't really a village, but a part of the city where private houses were still standing. When the center and most of the districts were given for the construction of high-rise buildings, the inhabitants of this part of the city refused, and there remained a settlement of private houses. It was quite small, but because of the heavy car traffic and the large number of plantations, it was sought after by teenagers in the evenings and children during the day. Vivian had no idea how her 18-year-old daughter had found this settlement, if it was far enough away from their apartment. Instead, the woman was greeted by the familiar fresh air and a view that hadn't changed at all. It was worth saying, the settlement hadn't changed in the 10 years she'd been out of town. Unlike the town, where new stores, buildings, schools, and kindergartens had sprung up, here stood the old grocery store, where a tall, full-figured Nellie, who never wore a blue apron, probably still worked. Vivian and her friends often ran behind the garages or sat in the village's cowering playground. Besides, there were lots of abandoned houses here, a teenager's paradise. There were streams and puddles everywhere. But Vivian remembered the way to the garages. She knew she wasn't likely to find anything there, but it was worth a try. Then she intended to ask around. In a place like this, everybody knows everybody. Really, Vivian grinned. The garages hadn't changed at all, except that they were a little dimmer than they had been 10 years ago. They still stood close together. In the middle was a beaten path where teenagers ran around, and one garage had an old 9-wheeler on it. No one knew how it had gotten there, but it had been there since before Vivian had moved in with her aunt. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the bench where the old man had been sitting, according to Lillian's story. And a little farther away stood an old, centuries-old oak tree, its branches spreading out for many meters. There stood the girl. Vivian looked around more carefully, hoping to find some hint of the old man who had made the boat. "Girl, you shouldn't stand where the cars go," a loud, very sonorous male voice sounded behind her. Vivian turned indignantly toward the man and opened her mouth to say what she thought, but she failed. "Damien, are you okay?" she said. In front of the woman stood her longtime and not the most pleasant acquaintance. He was the type of memory that you didn't really want to remember. Tall, blonde-haired, and very much like her. Oh gods, how badly did Vivian want him gone, disappear, like her father had once been, without a trace. That was her ultimate dream at 16, the woman thought. To meet him now was a complete surprise to her. "I live here." "How you ended up here," is the question. The man grinned. Damien was a year older than Vivian, but he was in the same grade as her. Due to a lot of moving around by his father, who was in the military, he changed schools often. A year after Laurel, Vivian's mom, died, Ellen got together with Damien's dad and the boy moved in with them. Or rather, he moved in with Vivian, for he shared a room with her for the next 2.5 years. It was a terrible 2.5 years. Vivian preferred never to remember them. 13 years ago, a tall, blonde-haired boy had flown into the room and thrown his backpack right onto the floor. The backpack was light. There were hardly any textbooks in it, but it hit the leg of a girl who was sitting at her desk trying to do her homework. It's worth saying, Vivian had always studied hard, trying to get good grades. But lately, because of the presence of an uninvited neighbor, she had fallen behind in her studies. So she had to do her homework when no one was in the apartment. Luckily, Damien liked to hang out after school with his buddies. "How many times do I have to tell you not to throw things in the room?" the girl asked angrily, not turning around. She had already started looking for her old headphones to isolate herself from Damien's chatter. Yes, it was his favorite thing to talk. While Vivian did her homework, he pestered her constantly. "This is my room too, Prickles. And you should stop worrying about order like this apartment is yours," Damien said. Vivian couldn't take it anymore and turned to face the guy. "You know, it doesn't matter where you are. Throwing things on the floor, talking loudly all night is unacceptable anywhere," she replied. Damien grinned and tossed the tattered tennis ball from one hand to the other. "You're too right, baby girl. We're only 9 months apart," the girl muttered resentfully and went back to her algebra homework. The headphones were finally plugged in, and Vivian could no longer hear Damien's annoying, mosquito-like voice. Not long after that day, Vivian lost her headphones. More correctly, Damien had ruined them, fed up with her ignoring his words. Then Vivian even cried. And now, many years later, she stood in the garages and looked at that same annoying and nasty face. Of course, they were no longer children, and Vivian herself had long since become a mother. But childish resentments don't just go away. That was why she felt a nasty suffocation in her soul, as if there had been an encounter she did not want. However, despite her feelings, Vivian smiled. "I recently moved here," she said. Damien shifted his gloves into another pocket and grinned. "I thought you had an apartment in Springfield, didn't you?" "I sold it," Vivian answered briefly. "And no, I don't want to talk about what happened." The man grinned. The familiar dimples appeared on his face. He was standing quite far away, but even from that distance Vivian could see the familiar light in his eyes. "Do you want to come in?" "I don't live far from here," Damien asked. "Or do you have something to do?" "Next time I will. Right now I've got 44 minutes before my shift starts. And I still have to find the homeless guy the 8-year-old kid described." Damien's eyes widened. He looked at the woman in surprise and grinned again. He didn't seem to understand anything, but he was insanely curious about the homeless man. Vivian didn't know if she should answer Damien, since she never liked him and only did nasty things to him. But sensibly, she briefly described the situation. She realized that it would be very difficult to find the old man without local help. Besides, Damien, like her, was a grown man. It would be foolish to ruin a chance to find a possible father because of a childhood grudge. "So you're looking for the man who made your daughter's boat?" Damien clarified. "I won't ask why you're looking, but I can't help you yet. I just bought a garage here. I don't know anything or anyone yet. But I'll be sure to ask around. Maybe someone can tell me something." Vivian nodded gratefully. She hadn't expected to be so lucky. It was the first time fate had taken pity on her. given that it was Damien, though. "Give me the number," he said. Vivian looked at him blankly. "I'll call you if I find anything." "Or do you want me to pigeonhole the answer?" Damien snickered. "No," Vivian mumbled. There he was, the real Damien, sarcastic and sarcastic. "Too bad," the man smiled wryly. "I would have had to get your address." Vivian held back the urge to reply and handed Damien a business card. He took it and whistled. "Juvenile Inspector, Senior Lieutenant Adams, Vivian. Not bad. I never thought you'd be on the police force." "In Springfield, I was a specialist in another field, and here they just hired me to raise kids. I never thought I'd be doing that," Vivian replied. "I didn't see myself as a schoolteacher either," the man chuckled and punched the number into his phone. Vivian's eyes went wide. "What? No way. You were dumb as a cork. How could I be?" Damien rolled his eyes and shook his head. 13 years later, and you're still so self-righteous and self-important." "Who's to say?" Vivian snorted. "All right, well, if you hear anything, give me a call." She hurriedly left without saying goodbye. The thoughts and feelings of childhood returned. Someone will probably say it's strange that they're almost 30 years old. What childish resentments. But for Vivian, immersed in her own problems after the death of her mother and the disappearance of her father, it was the last straw. A drinking aunt, a strange man in the apartment, and a man who took her room and made her worry almost every day. She almost lost her gold medal because of him, and had a fight with her aunt so bad that she threatened to get rid of her niece. It wasn't just a childish grudge, it was something that couldn't be forgotten. "Baby, stay with Aunt Stacey. She'll look after you," Vivian whispered quietly in her daughter's ear. "But where are you going so late?" Vivian sighed. She couldn't tell her daughter the truth. "I was called for work," she replied. Lilia nodded and hugged her mother. "Aunt Stacey, I'll pick her up in the morning then, so I don't wake you up, okay?" Vivian said to her tall, thin neighbor. Stacey nodded. It wasn't the first time she'd stayed with a girl whose mother worked all the time. There were a lot of downsides to raising a child alone. Vivian left Stacey's apartment and went about her business. She got into the old car that had once belonged to her husband and drove off. At 12:30 at night, the bell rang. On the other side was Damien's slightly agitated voice, asking to come urgently to the abandoned school building. Vivian was angry. She just didn't understand what he wanted from her at almost midnight. But he was asking to come urgently. So she sent her daughter to a neighbor's house and set off towards the school building herself, remembering where it was. Night roads were a nightmare for the woman. She hated driving anywhere in the dark. The fear left over from the accident constantly rattled her, but the odd joking text messages Damien sent kept Vivian driving on. She just wanted to remember a couple of self-defense techniques and smash his smug nose in his face for upsetting her daughter and making Vivian herself drive at midnight to an unknown destination. Oh, how angry she was. But there was nothing she could do. She just gripped the steering wheel and read the dumb jokes and Damien's messages out of the corner of her eye. Vivian wouldn't be surprised if she arrived at the building and he was waiting for her with a smile and said he was just bored. The car had to be parked far away from her destination simply because the woman didn't know what kind of soil was there. Considering it was spring, there could be snow as well as knee-deep water. And that was a best-case scenario. Vivian climbed out of the car and turned on her flashlight. A good thing she had guessed to grab one, trying to remember the way to the abandoned school. Vivian tried to walk through the mud and snow. Good thing her shoes didn't get wet. Despite excelling in her studies, she always liked to have fun with her friends. She never lagged behind her girlfriends in relationships, also ran behind garages and came home after midnight tipsy. Really, it was once or twice, no more. Auntie was to blame. While the other girls sprayed themselves with tons of perfume and lit a whole pack to cover up the smell of cigarettes and alcohol, Vivian didn't have to do that. Aunt Eleanor didn't care about her. She was immersed in herself and her memoirs. Vivian wanted to listen to moralizing like the others, wanted to cover up odors and try to get out of the house after midnight, but she couldn't. Eleanor herself sometimes asked her why she didn't drink. invited her to her bohemian parties and suggested her acquaintances as suitors. Because of this, Vivian often left the house or sat with her headphones on. At that time, she and her friends climbed all the abandoned houses in the neighborhood. Of course, the huge school building didn't go unnoticed. Memory did not fail Vivian. She identified exactly where the school was located. It was a huge, crumbling building that had once been the site of a factory, then a garment shop, and then abandoned. 10 years ago, the building had been considered a wreck, but now it seemed to be held together by nothing but good word of mouth. Vivian sighed and walked inside. She couldn't figure out what Damien wanted in this place or why he needed her. As she entered, she heard the annoying creaking of the wooden floor, which was like a sieve of mouse droppings. There was trash, cigarette butts and bottles lying everywhere. Vivian pulled out her cell phone and asked Damien where he was. In response, he shined the phone from somewhere above. "Where are you? Why did you drag me out of bed?" Vivian shouted. "Over here, Evans." Damien's voice sounded. "Damien." Vivian broke into a run, but the man's warning shout stopped her. Damien was hanging from a hole in the floor on the second floor. Apparently, he had fallen through it. He somehow kept his balance and even managed to hold the phone. "The floor is very unreliable. You get there, you might fall through it yourself," Damien explained, shining the light on the floor. Vivian nodded. She was well aware of that too. "Why didn't you call 911? Figured since you got me in here, you'd have to get me out," Damien sighed indignantly. "The guys told me about the local homeless guy who lives at the school. They say he walks around, helps everyone, and they feed him for it." "Yeah, they give him clothes. Are you sure it's him?" Vivian asked excitedly, and then she stopped. "Okay, I get it. We'll talk about it later. For now, we need to figure out how to get you out. Shouldn't we call the emergency services?" Damien didn't have time to answer. The plank beneath him began to make an ear-splitting creak and squeak. Sure, the height wasn't too great. He would probably survive the fall. But it wasn't just the height. The first floor was full of beams, metal objects and such. If he fell on them, no ambulance would help. Vivian gasped and rushed up the stairs. For a second, she was seized by memories she'd rather not remember. Of that very day, she hadn't heard Damien yell. She only heard the damn boards that creaked like a crunch in her body and generally made too many sounds that just kept the woman from concentrating. She realized that the emergency services wouldn't make it in time. Remembering her lessons on rescuing drowning people, Vivian spun on the floor as soon as she heard the creaking beneath her. She prayed to God that she wouldn't fall. An image of a daughter who might be alone came to mind, but then another, darker and gloomier one. Vivian crawled harder. Carefully, she pulled off her belt. Vivian tossed one end to Damien. He tossed his phone back to the ladder and picked up the end of the belt. Vivian grabbed some kind of beam with her other hand and started pulling. "I'm not going to follow you," Damien warned. "No, I'm not." Vivian parried and pulled again. Damien started to crawl out of the hole, but it was painfully slow, and the floor beneath them creaked harder and harder. The man seemed to be stuck, thanks to the thick jacket that kept him from falling. However, it didn't let him get out either. Vivian managed to pull Damien out of his trap, and she was sweating. Her arm ached. When the floor was beneath the man, he crawled slowly toward the flimsy staircase. Vivian went down to the first floor first and sighed in relief as she unbuttoned her jacket. "You're crazy," Damien said, leaning against the wall. "I remember when we caught a guy last year, and I had to do a lot more pirouettes than that." The woman grinned. A second after she said that, a beam fell a few centimeters from where Damien was. It fell through to the first floor and split in two with a clatter. Both Vivian and Damien stood wide-eyed. "About time," Damien said and exhaled. "It could have been me." The angry look the woman threw at the boy was unmatched. For a second, it seemed like Damien would have chosen to go back. "Why the hell did you call me instead of the emergency services? Have you had enough of life, you idiot? Are you out of your mind?" Vivian shouted, approaching the man. "You're an idiot and a moron." "Are you scared for me?" Damien asked, perplexed. Vivian stopped speaking and leaned against the icy stone wall, crying. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held back as she always did. "I'm losing everyone," she said hoarsely. "And lately it seems to be my curse. I've lost my mother, my father, my husband. I didn't bury my mother in front of my children as a grown woman. When I was 13. I didn't understand what had happened or how this was possible. My father was out of my life even earlier, starting a series of these events. I was 10. I didn't even have time to memorize what he looked like. If it wasn't for the pictures, I wouldn't have known." Vivian continued in a shaky voice. "I buried my husband, not as a gray-haired old woman with trembling hands, but with a child in my arms, a 7-year-old girl who to this day doesn't understand why Daddy left her. And Daddy, at the last second of his life, called me. Not the emergency services, not the ambulance, but me." One traitorous tear rolled out of Vivian's eye, but she brushed it away so quickly Damien didn't notice. He'd been in an accident. The car flipped over, warped. It was impossible to get out from the inside. He realized that, so he called me and apologized. I was at work interviewing a witness. I was angry that he interrupted me. Then I got a voicemail from him. I wanted to open it, but I got a call from the ambulance. He was driving in the dark late at night, and he sent a video of him saying goodbye to his daughter. Vivian covered her face with her hands and breathed heavily. She couldn't understand why she was saying all this. Much less Damien, truth be told, he didn't care who to tell anymore. In the 8 months that Greg had been gone, Vivian had never, ever told anyone about her pain. "That's why I was afraid for you. Because I won't suffer another death. Especially one that's my fault," she said in a muffled voice. Damien put his hand on Vivian's shoulder. "I'm sorry, I really am. It was stupid of me to come here alone and call you." Vivian raised her eyes to the man and shook her head. "I'm just glad you're alive. I'm glad it's all over. Wait." Vivian's discerning eye spotted movement in the darkness, as if someone was standing there eavesdropping. The woman snatched the flashlight from Damien's hands and shone it into the darkness. A short man with a beard and mustache, wearing an old hat, a tattered cotton jacket, and old boots, was looking at her. Vivian recognized him. It was exactly as Lillian had described him. "Papa," she whispered. Vivian remembered little about her father. Vivian was short in stature, shorter than Laurel, and certainly shorter than Ellen. Her father had a tattoo on his forearm and a large scar behind his ear. Vivian didn't know where it came from, but she remembered her father telling more and more stories about its origins. At first she believed it. Eventually she realized she was being lied to. Now an old man with gray hair and a sad, frightened look stood before Vivian, and she had absolutely no way of knowing if it was her father or not. She took a step forward, but Damien grabbed her arm. "Father, what are you talking about?" Vivian waved the man away and made her way toward the old man. With slow, cautious steps, she was afraid to startle him. "Good evening. My name is Vivian. Your name?" The old man smiled, revealing yellow teeth. "My name's Stephen. Your father's name was Eugene, wasn't it?" Damien asked with his usual sneer. Vivian rolled her eyes and chose not to answer. "You don't recognize me. I realize it's been 19 years, but..." 19? The old man interjected. "That's the only years I remember. I didn't count, of course, but about 20 years ago I woke up in another city in the snow, remembering nothing." Stephen lowered his head and began to speak hoarsely, as if remembering something he very much disliked. Vivian listened attentively, trying to look at the unfamiliar features of his face. "I lived there for a few years, and then I came to this lovely little town by chance. The people here were very kind. Not like the people where I woke up. They feed me, they give me water, they even give me clothes. And it's not a bad place to live. It's chilly in winter, of course, but I'm used to it." Shocked by the face and complete incomprehension, Vivian looked at the old man in front of her. She listened to him, and she felt scared, as if what he told her had happened to her personally. It was so horrible that she took a few slow steps back and leaned against the wall again. Damien touched her shoulder again and nodded, letting her know he was close by. "So you don't remember anything that happened before you woke up in that city?" Damien asked, giving Vivian time to pause. The old man shook his head. "Do you have a tattoo of a ship on your forearm?" Vivian asked. Stephen smiled as he looked at the girl and rolled up the sleeve of his wide jacket. "There are dots right there. Ships. I've always liked them. They're beautiful, you have to admit. Born to travel. We don't have the sea to get a glimpse of this splendor." The air stuck in Vivian's lungs and wouldn't come out. She looked helplessly at Damien and nodded. The man looked at the old man strangely. There was distrust and suspicion in his gaze. "And the crescent-shaped scar behind his ear?" Stephen shrugged his shoulders. "I haven't had to look in a mirror in 20 years. "I am," the old man said, nodding. Damien walked over to him and asked him to remove the hat behind his ear. There was indeed a large, thick scar that looked like a crescent moon. The man turned to Vivian and nodded. She couldn't hold back a sigh. Her knees trembled so hard it felt like the ground was about to go out from under her feet, and her hands couldn't grasp the phone in her pocket. Someone had texted. Right now, though, it didn't matter at all. Holding herself back, Vivian pulled out her phone, and from under the case pulled out an old, tattered photo of her father and mother. They were smiling happily together and looking at the camera. "Careful, Vivian." She held the photo out to Damien. He showed it to the old man with a flashlight. "Do you recognize it?" Stephen shrugged his shoulders as usual. "The man, not so much. But the woman looks familiar, and she's beautiful. I think I've even dreamt about her sometimes. Yes, that's definitely her. I couldn't figure out where I'd seen her. She comes to me in my dreams, often talking nonsense." "Well, that's not surprising. The cold makes you dream." "That's my parents, Laurel and Yugi Swan. 19 years ago, my father went missing. He was short, with a tattoo of a ship on his forearm and a scar behind his ear. He made paper ships and gave them to children." "How did you give a ship to my daughter?" Vera asked. The old man listened to her in silence. Don't you dare say a word against it. There was a storm of emotions on his wrinkled face, from fear to hope. It seemed as if he were about to cry. "And what makes you think I am your father, madam?" he said at last. "Yes," Vera answered distinctly. "Why didn't you say you were looking for your father?" Damien whispered almost in Faith's face. They talked Stephen or Eugene into having Damien come over to their house for the night and go to the hospital the next day. Admittedly, it wasn't an option Damien liked very much, his apartment having been turned into a sleepover. "I wasn't sure." Vera shrugged and walked over to the sink to pour water. "I couldn't tell you that maybe my father was a bum who gave the kids paper boats. I thought I was crazy. Besides, it's not your place to tell me that." "Is it okay to bring him to my house?" "First of all, you suggested it. Second of all, it's not okay to bring him to my house. I'd have Lily come over in the morning and find a homeless guy smelling like garbage on the couch." Damien nodded. "Okay, Vivian, I get it. I have a former neurologist who works at Central Hospital. I'll call her in the morning and see what I can do." "Yeah, well, call me and I'll try to get there early." There was a loud sigh. Damien rolled his eyes expressively. "Where are you going?" "At 2 in the morning. Stay. I've got a great bed. I also have a folding chair bed. Girl, you have clothes to sleep in, don't you?" Vivian nodded. She was very tired and didn't even try to refuse Damien's offer. In the few hours they had spent together, the hatred and bad memories had faded away. Maybe it was the fatigue that had caused it. Or maybe Vivian finally realized that they weren't children anymore. Despite their tiredness and even disconnectedness, neither Vivian nor Damien wanted to sleep. The man stripped the bed and spread out the couch. At first, Damien tried to walk quietly around his apartment, but then he realized that it was very difficult to wake Stephen. It wasn't surprising, though. Stephen slept in an abandoned building next door to alcoholics. They hardly behaved quietly at night. Vivian made tea for 2. A man came in and plumped tiredly in a chair. "So why a former doctor?" Vivian smiled and sipped her green tea. It should be clarified that Vivian liked to steer the topic away from herself. She hated being the center of attention. The reason for this was that she was afraid, being always in her aunt's house, to be an appendix to the apartment rather than a member of it. Vivian carried this behavior into later life as well. She hardly had any friends. Those couple of colleagues from work and former classmates remained in Kasimov, where the woman had lived for the last 10 years. She did not make acquaintances in the new city, and admittedly she didn't want to. For example, Vivian met Stacey by accident, having mixed up the doors of the apartment in the building where Lily and Vivian live. Not all the apartments have a number on them, because the house is newly built, and not even all the apartments have been sold yet. Those who have already settled in have put numbers on their doors. Vivian and Stacey, who had just moved in, didn't have time to do that. Late one night, after hanging out with a rude teenager who had been drinking, Vivian came home and got the wrong apartment door. She banged on Stacey's door for 20 minutes before she called the police. It took the police officer a long time to figure out what had happened. Damien grinned and shook his head. Vivian noticed that he was doing that a little too often lately. "Do you care about that?" Vivian shrugged and took another sip of her tea. It was hot and warmed her body. It was only now that she realized how tired and cold she was. "I was afraid," she said reluctantly. "We didn't see eye to eye." Vivian laughed. "It's not for me to know that it's almost impossible to get along with you." Damien smiled. "But that phrase is almost always an excuse. So what happened? Did I cheat?" "No, of course not," the man brushed it off. "She just wanted children. All her life she'd dreamed of a big wedding and a family. And I was 22. I'd just gotten back from the army, and admittedly, I wasn't planning to have kids for the next couple of years. Of course, we tried to live together, to stop quarreling, but in the end, she left." Dina smiled sadly. "I drank tea without sugar. Do you remember? It's nice." "It's hard to forget. I used to run to the kitchen and make you tea 5 times a day because you were lazy. Maybe I liked it when you looked after me." "No, you just liked picking on me," Vivian grinned, glancing at the wall. While Damien was gone, she had time to look around the apartment a bit and was basically surprised. Despite the outside clutter, it was clean. The one-bedroom apartment resembled the one Vivian had lived in with Ellen. A large room, a living room, and a small bedroom. The kitchen, surprisingly, was done in very nice modern colors with a tall table and a few paired chairs. It wasn't hard to realize that the man lived here alone, though. There was one skillet on the stove and one plate and fork in the sink. There was one cup on the countertop. Vivian had to work hard to find the other cup. "So what's your ex-girlfriend's name?" "I get it. You just don't want to talk about it, right?" "Okay, I played along. Her name was Abby, and she's a great name. The girl's a great neurologist and probably a good wife. She's also a mom, had a son a few years ago, and surprisingly, I became his godfather." "No way. I've always found it hard to maintain good relationships with exes. How would I know, though? My husband was my only partner, and he died. So tragic and pathetic. He died and I stayed." Vivian pitched forward and opened her eyes in surprise. "No way. She's 90 years old." 82 was celebrated at the beginning of the year, Damien replied. "She still tells stories about being in England in 1950. Vivian couldn't stop laughing. It felt like someone had jammed the on button. "I can't understand how you got into school," she said with a laugh. "I could never associate you with a teacher, except as a criminal." "Did you ever associate me with anyone?" Damien asked, smiling with the corners of his lips. The silence was more eloquent than any phrase. Vivian had never really seen Damien as a good person, never thought he'd become anything more than a bully. "There was a time when there was no work at all. My father was drinking himself to death, going crazy," Damien said, shifting the mug of tea from hand to hand. "There was nothing to live on. My neighbor worked at the school as a vice principal. She'd retroactively enrolled me in some kind of teacher training course and got me a job as an OBL teacher in September. Hotabike had just retired." "Hotabike? What did they call the old OBL teacher who wore a long beard and was bald?" Vivian asked. "Surprisingly, I liked it," Damien continued. The pay wasn't great, but it was livable. I graduated as a history teacher, and now I have 2 jobs in classroom management. Vivian and Damien talked a little more about different things: work, family, and the past. They talked about the past only in passing, trying not to talk about how they felt about each other. For the first time in years, Vivian closed the gestalt of her resentment over what she thought was a spoiled childhood. "Thank you," the woman said as she and Damien went to bed. The man looked at her perplexed. "For keeping the conversation going and not letting me shut down," Vivian explained. Vivian leaned forward and opened her eyes in surprise. "For keeping me from thinking about what's going on with me and my father." "You're welcome," Damien replied simply and succinctly. "I've always done this. I'm not used to it." "What are you talking about?" Vivian asked, confused. "When we lived at Aunt Lily's house, it happened a lot. She'd say something to you, and you'd dwell on the words, the thoughts. I could see how you couldn't handle the flow of thoughts and delusions in your head. That's why you were talking nonsense. You were just trying to distract me from thinking." Damien shrugged. "Sometimes I just like to piss you off," he said, and retreated to the bedroom, where he went to sleep in a small and hardly comfortable chair, leaving Vivian alone with her thoughts. She couldn't believe it. She really had a fixation on what she was being told. Vivian spent long periods of time thinking about problems and their solutions, and knew about the problem, but she could never think that Damien noticed it. However, they had lived in the same room for several years. It would have been strange not to notice it. "We've got a lot of tests to do, of course, MRIs, blood work, and so on." Abby turned nervously to the door of room 8, where Stephen was lying. "Besides, it's important to get him out of the state he's in right now, since he doesn't have any identification. My hands are tied. If the story Damien told me is true, you should start recovering the documents immediately so we can start treatment." Abby was a petite blonde woman wearing square glasses with a round face and dimples on her cheeks. She smiled at everyone and was polite. She was also very excited about Damien's arrival. She seemed to really care about him. Only Vivian couldn't tell in what way she cared for him. "Thank you, Abby," Vivian said. "But if he hasn't had memories for 20 years, can they come back?" Abby put her head down into the clipboard. 20 years is a long time," she replied. "Patients usually recover quickly with supervision," Amy said. "But your father has signs of frostbite, signs of beating. He's also probably been drinking and smoking. Plus he was eating leftovers. That obviously didn't make things any better. Also, for memories to come back, you need familiar surroundings, familiar people. And he was living in an abandoned school, and hardly anyone was trying to help him. I can't say for sure, but the chances are slim to none. We'll do what we can, but I can't make any promises. Especially not until he has his papers." Vivian covered her face with her hand and shook her head. She didn't know what to do or how to be. The situation was getting worse and worse by the second. "Thank you, Abby." Damien smiled and walked away with Abby somewhere. When he returned, Vivian looked sadly at the room where her father lay. The orderlies had cleaned and dressed him. Vivian had brought new clothes. Now the woman was sure this old man was her father, short, with blue eyes, a scar and a tattoo. She had found him. Except he didn't remember anything. And that was terrible. Damien called out. "I've been thinking about the documents. We can't recover them yet." "With a stone in my heart," Vivian said. Her words were soaked with grief and heaviness. Dad had a business, apartments, money, and he'd disappeared too suddenly. And he was in a foreign city. Mom said he was away on a business trip. When he disappeared, he flew out. But he couldn't come back. And I think it's for a reason. He's clearly been helped to forget his life. If we recover the documents and his status, those involved might be very unhappy." Damien nodded and leaned against the cold wall, adjusting the white robe slung over his shoulders. 20 years have passed. Do you really think anyone still cares? I've been on the force for 7 years and, I've seen so much brutality. People are sometimes willing to remember things from decades ago, Vivian said. And if it's about money, they never forget. Yeah, I get it, Damien nodded. When you and I need to find out who's responsible for what happened as soon as possible. Otherwise, we won't be able to cure your father. Thank you for helping me and not going against my better judgment. You're welcome. Damien chuckled. I've never been against you. Immediately, a memory from 12 years ago came to his mind. What made you think you could yell at her? Damien had shouted in the face of Ellen, who was standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine, chewing slowly on an expensive cheese. Why do you think she is to blame for your troubles? She's been here longer than I expected. There's no point in living on my money. It's hard work, and she doesn't realize it, said Helene. Really? And what kind of labor do you do? Damien asked snidely, squinting his eyes. A third sentence a day, or maybe sleeping with another man. Why are you looking at me like that? I know about your lovers and the fact that you're cheating on my father. So, you should tell him, Ellen whispered. You can't? Maybe because your daddy's a drunk and he's about to be fired from his job. Oh, you won't even have a place to live. So don't cross me, puppy. You got it? From the hallway came the sound of the door opening. Ellen smiled and waved her hand at the floor, where a large purple mug with some writing on it had toppled over. No, Damien shouted. Oh, Damien, how could you break your favorite mug? Ellen asked, deliberately loud. Vivian flew into the kitchen and saw the purple shards with the boy standing next to it. How dare you? Crooked. Hands, you moron, she shouted. Damien sighed and gave Ellen a long look. These were his last days in this apartment, because soon this woman would kick both him and his father out. Damien knew that, but even more so, he realized that he couldn't do anything to change his mind, or he'd be on the streets for sure. He was sitting in his house when Vivian called and asked him to come over. Luckily, he had a sick day. After hearing about Vivian's problems, he realized he would have to take a mini vacation. Abby was happy to help open up the sick leave. To briefly talk about Damien, we can say that he is quite a kind person. Yes, in high school, and even in college, he was never known for being overly disciplined and submissive. And without hiding the truth, in the army too, not once fell for the rudeness of his superiors. However, with time it passed, and he began to take everything easier. He never refused to help anyone, but at the same time he was not particularly appreciated in the teaching staff. He often ridiculed other teachers, taking the side of students, realizing perfectly well that he had once been the same. Of course, no one could fire him. He did not break any rules, but good relations could not be built. The once popular boy turned into a man who rarely left the house. Most of his friends had left for other cities, and those that remained had families. Damien rarely went out for vacations, devoting most of his time to work. Vivian was a ray of light in his dull and ordinary life. He even enjoyed going to abandoned houses and trying to find Vivian's father. Damien got in his car and drove to the address. He didn't know what Vivian had in mind there, but he didn't care. Talking to her gave him pleasure. He was no longer thinking about how to make it through the weekend. His head was filled with other thoughts. The door to the Johnsons' apartment was open. "Damien, you come in," shouted a woman's voice from the far room. The man made his way there and saw a large desk piled with folders, with a laptop standing next to it, covered in pictures. "What kind of archive file is this?" Damien grinned and threw his backpack on the couch. "I had an acquaintance from the American Home Office send over all the documents from my father's missing persons case," the woman said. "And how did he send them so quickly?" "That you traveled overnight to Denver to get them," Damien wondered. "Vivian, you're a weirdo," she waved him off and walked over to the stack of folders. "Let's go look at everything." "Are you going to help or don't you think?" Damien asked, approaching the desk. "I need to find the culprit, or my father won't be able to go back to normal. Let's figure this out. You can take care of the laptop. There's a file on there with all of Dad's biography, his phone records, and his possessions. An acquaintance did a good job, though. He and I worked in Denver before he moved. He just happens to have access to the database, so he's helped me out a lot. Come on, the sooner we get started, the sooner we'll be done. Oh, by the way, Lily's gonna be here soon. We need to figure out what to tell her." A few hours later, the front door slammed and Lily came running into the room. She was happy and cheerful, clearly wanting to tell her mother something. When she saw the strange man, however, she was embarrassed. "Hello," the girl said quietly. Damien smiled and waved. Vivian took her daughter into the kitchen. She was gone for a long time, so the man decided not to waste any time. He continued flipping through the files. His gaze stopped on the largest and most labeled author's file. The man opened it and began to read slowly and thoughtfully. With each line he was surprised more and more. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Vivian came back in and quietly closed the door. She's really tired, she's already gone to bed. Good thing tomorrow is a day off, no homework to do. Where has she been? Late at a friend's house. Did you find something? What do you know about your father's business? Vivian shrugged. I was 10, didn't have much interest in it then, and when I did, there was no one to ask. I also knew why my mother and I didn't get the business. Yeah, they weren't married, so my mom's last name was Swan. We also didn't get Grandma's 4-bedroom apartment. Not for that reason. There's another, Damien said seriously. Listen carefully. When your father's firm opened, there was a stipulation that shares could not be inherited through bloodlines. That is, when one of the partners dies or withdraws, all the shares go to the remaining partners in the firm. Is that legal? Vivian wondered. Yes, but it's rare. I suspect your father didn't think much about family when he started the firm. He and Mom got together later. But that's not all. Do you know how many partners there were? Vivian shook her head and climbed onto the couch with her feet up. 4. Your father, Matthew, Johnson, and Smith. Do you know how many are left now? 1. Johnson. Do you think? Wait. 3 years before your father went missing, Matthew died. Heart attack. 41 years old. That early. That's not the only thing that's strange. The thing is, the will he left behind said his shares were to be inherited by your father. But that's impossible. He had no right under domestic law to transfer the shares to outsiders. But he transferred them to a partner. And your father got a controlling interest and the ability to run the firm almost on his own. But why did Matthew do that? Damien wondered. Matthew, the 3 M's. That's them on the boat my father made for Lily. There was a sign that's on my boat too. The 3 M's. Matthew. I don't remember much about my father, but I do know that my father fell in love with the sea when he met his friend. And everything in the house connected to the sea was connected to this friend. I couldn't remember his name, but I think it was Matthew. So he left a will to his father. Perhaps he knew or felt something. But that's not all. Damien continued. 5 years later, after your father went missing, Smith died of an accident. 5 years is the time frame after which a person is declared dead, Vivian said thoughtfully. Which means that, by law, the firm passes to the remaining partners, and Johnson, to get the full package, gets rid of the other partner. And remains the sole bannels of the firm, Vivian whispered. So you think my father was eliminated to get the inheritance? Yes, Damien nodded. I suspect that Johnson and Smith conspired to get 50% of the firm's shares that your father had. How did it go unnoticed? Didn't it become suspicious to anyone? They must have been quite cleverly planned, said Vivian, confused. Money is everything. You know who can live and who can't. The only thing that confuses me is the fact that your father is alive, Damien said thoughtfully. Matthew and Smith are dead, but your father isn't. And here it's simple. I think those who wanted to get rid of my father just hid him and dumped him somewhere. I don't know. He survived, and lucky for them, he lost his memory. It's scary to realize that, Damien admitted. But let's take our minds off it for a moment. Do you have coffee? Vivian nodded and got up from the couch. Her gaze was slightly detached. She wasn't looking around, her eyes were fixed on one point. Are you okay? Damien asked gently. So is there coffee? A few minutes later, Vivian was already standing at the stove, making coffee. You're not busy tomorrow? Will you sit with Lillian? I'm going to Casimov to see Johnson. I want to ask him something. Damien, who was sitting at the table, jumped up and in 2 steps was next to Vivian. Are you out of your mind? We just assumed he was responsible for 2 people being dead, 1 20 years without memory, and you decide to go straight to him and declare that you know he's a criminal. Don't scream, Vivian said tiredly, and lowered her gaze to Damien's hands that held her shoulders. She could feel his warmth and strong grip. "Let me go, or the coffee will be on the floor in a few seconds." Damien slowly let go of her, looking down at his hands. He ah-hed, as if waking up. Apparently he had done it unknowingly. "Are you worried?" Vivian asked, not demanding an answer. "I've worked with such personalities, so you don't have to worry about my safety." Vivian looked at Damien with disbelief. "I'll go with you," the man said firmly, his confident gaze fixed directly on Vivian. No arguments. "Yeah, I get why you're so involved in my problems," Vivian asked as they sat down at the table and started drinking coffee. Damien was taken aback and looked at the woman incomprehensively. "But you know, when I met you, the negative emotions that I experienced as a child flared up in my soul. It's childish, I know. Well, haven't you ever had that?" A quiet chuckle escaped Damien's lips, and he shook his head. "No. Maybe it's because I've never felt negative about you." "How could you? You were always playing tricks on me," Vivian exclaimed. "Yes, you said you talked nonsense when you didn't want me to dwell on my thoughts. But that wasn't always the case. You broke the mug my friends gave me, broke my headphones, made fun of me at school, and even told off the guys I dated. You ruined my life," Vivian said slowly, trying to control her sudden emotions. "Remember the new headphones for my birthday? Yes, it was the only present from Aunt Ellen in all the years. Why are you looking at me like that?" "No, wasn't that her present?" Damien grinned. He squinted at the woman, trying to figure out how someone so smart and savvy could be so naive. "The boys and I used to work part-time during the summer. I used the money to buy them. I didn't have enough to buy them, but I had to borrow some from my father. It was his stash in case of a hangover. I had a hell of a time." Vivian looked at the man confused. She gently took his hand and tilted her head. "Why? You needed them so you wouldn't listen to me. I saw how worried you were about them. I thought you hated me. Did you? Did you? I liked Vivian, and I was a stupid boy who liked her that way. Do you understand? It's a corny story, you say." Vivian stared blankly in front of her. In an instant, her world had been turned upside down. She felt that something was wrong, but she could never figure out what it was. Coping with her emotions, the woman jumped up from the table and announced, "It's decided. Tomorrow we go to Kasimov." "Vivian, my dear, is it really you?" "You were about 13 when I last saw you," asked Daniel Forrester, an older man in an expensive suit. He jumped up from his chair as soon as he realized who had come to see him. Damien and Vivian eyed the man warily. It was unclear why he was so hospitable to them. He took them to a local cafe and ordered several not cheap meals himself. "Don't worry, I'm paying. After all, this firm was built by your father with labor and sweat," he said. "It's a shame you couldn't find him. It was you who paid for 8 years to find him." Damien asked. Vivian looked at him shocked. "Yes, I had hoped to find something," Daniel nodded. "But it's like he's gone to ground. All your partners have disappeared, don't you think?" "I recognize my father's grip," Daniel grinned and smiled sadly. "Yes, it was like that. I honestly could never believe it was an accident. First Mike, then Eugene, and then Ben, one after another. I spent the next 6 years taking the trash out with security. I was afraid I'd suffer the same fate." "Weren't you the one who set that fate up?" Vivian asked me snidely. "No, I didn't have to. Ben's death, at least. After your father went missing, the controlling interest went to me, not Ben. Well, I mean, he split it between us, but I had 51%. That's better. Young man, I don't suppose you've ever run a big firm on your own. Believe me, it's not that easy. I was going to give some of my shares to Ben to take over. And Ben knew that. As a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience, I did the word processing as follows. And several other lawyers drafted the contract. And then Ben died in an accident. And there was definitely an accident. 2 other workers died on that construction site, safety violations. The site was just shut down. It's all in Ben's file. So I had nothing to do with it." Daniel Forrester smiled sadly and sipped from his glass of water. "Besides, I definitely had nothing to do with Eugene's disappearance. I had no idea when or what time he was going home. Only Ben knew his flight time. Vivian looked at Damien with confusion. If Daniel Forrester was to be believed, their version was crumbling before their eyes. And Ben. How had he behaved in the years since Eugene Stepanovich had disappeared? Damien asked carefully. He was always calling someone and nervous. I was sure he'd just taken a mistress. You could hear in his voice that he was calling a woman. That's quite normal. For him, he was always very nervous and restless. They say that's why he died. You have to stay calm on a construction site. Vivian and Damien asked Daniel Forrester a few more questions and left. Already in the car, they looked at each other confusedly. Do you think it's not him? Vivian asked. Not only did he spend 8 years paying for the search, but he also erected a huge monument to your father. I read in the files he was actually going to give 10% of the shares to Kartashov, which would have made him the leader. I don't think he just changed his mind and took him out. And he couldn't have been involved in Mike's death because he was in Israel for over 6 months. How do you know all this? Vivian snatched the laptop out of Damien's hands and took a deep breath. Who gave you permission? You didn't think I'd let you go talk to an alleged criminal. Vivian turned away from Damien and muttered something quietly to herself. But Damien could see the edge of a smile on the woman's face. I can't get over the fact that Kartashov kept calling someone. I wish I knew who it was. 20 years ago, not everyone had a cell phone, and most people called from landlines. So the lady's number could have been saved somewhere. If Kartashov's things were still there, Damien concluded. Vivian grinned and started the car. I read something too. I can't believe you got into the house, Damien whispered and sneezed. Vivian drove them to the house where Kartashov had once lived. Because he had no one, the house was left empty and became just another abandoned building. In fact, no one lives here. So I don't see anything wrong with it, she said. Did you use a tire iron to knock the boards off the windows and get in? Damien objected. Oh, it's nothing. We'll write it off to the teenagers. Vivian shrugged and walked on, shining her flashlight on the way. Here, Damien shouted. Vivian walked over and saw the phone with the phone book next to it. How will we know which number we need? The woman shrugged and opened the dusty old book. Damien and Vivian gasped at the dust that rose. It's been so many years. After all, the book flipped through very quickly, pages skipping, until Vivian saw a number written in red pen. Judging by the spread of the book, it was the page that had been opened the most. The number had been circled several times in pencil. It's not signed, Damien said. It doesn't need to be, Vivian said sadly. I know it by heart. They walked outside in a terrible mood, not knowing how to react to the news. Damien looked straight into Vivian's eyes. He stepped closer to her and kissed her. Vivian was taken aback. What are you doing? You just got into the house, found the culprit. Well, almost. And probably helped your father. You're awesome. You know that? You're not what I thought you were either, Vivian admitted and blushed. Here's how I edited the continuation of the text according to your instructions. This is the first time in your life you've ever admitted you were wrong, Damien grinned, and Vivian punched him in the shoulder painfully. You can't make me change my mind. Vivian smiled imperceptibly. Ellen Swan, is that you? A tall man in black clothing asked, holding out his ID card in front of him. Did you know Ben Kartashov? No, the woman replied hysterically as she was questioned at the police station. Your phone number was found in his address book. There are also witnesses who saw you together. So what? He was my lover, Ellen held her head high. And the mastermind behind the attack on your brother. He was the only one who knew when he was going home. Eugene was attacked near the train station. An attack? Ellen shouted. Are you out of your mind? Why would I harm my own brother? Your mother's 4-room apartment, answered the investigator clearly and succinctly. You were up to your neck in debt that year. You had loans. And I suspect not only the banks owed. And immediately after receiving the inheritance, 6 months later you put the apartment for sale, and it was very quickly bought. which suggests that a buyer was found early. You paid off the debt, got rid of your brother, whose considerable bank account went to you and his daughter. And since she was young, her mother put her money aside. And when Laurel died, you got the rest. That's where you got the money for the social gatherings. Ellen Swan, isn't it? The investigator asked sneeringly. Your niece has provided all the evidence that will help me put you away for a long time, as well as solve a case from 20 years ago. So you can go ahead and get a lawyer. Ellen, you're definitely going to need one. The investigator was an old friend of Vivian's. She heard the whole conversation thanks to the recording phone. They listened to the tapes with Damien. The man held Vivian's hand. Did you win? He smiled. We did. Vivian corrected and squeezed Damien's hand tighter. 3 years later, a large truck labeled transportation stopped in front of the 3-story house. 2 uniformed men got out of the truck and headed toward the house, keys in hand. An older car was parked next to the truck, from which a blonde-haired man with a large bag on his shoulder got out. He surveyed the area and opened the back door. A tall girl of about 11 years old climbed out. She was smiling cheerfully and looking around, hoping to spot something interesting. She was holding a large paper boat. A short, bald old man with a beard got out of the passenger seat. Loaders, he shouted. Where's Vivian? She should have gotten here before us, Damien replied in a warm voice to the old man, Yugi. Damien shrugged and pulled out his phone to dial Vivian's number. Probably socializing with criminals again. It's such nice weather and she's at work again, the old man complained. Nature around here is so beautiful. May had blossomed, the smell of lilacs was everywhere. And the sun was shining so brightly that it seemed as if summer had already arrived. The trees were covered with little leaves. Birds sang on all sides, and the pond behind the house glistened in the sun. It really was grace. Not just nice weather, but Vivian was at work again. She had been spending too much time there lately, Damien thought. Uncle Damien, look. Lillian shouted and pointed to the road where a police car with flashing lights was coming at almost full speed. 100 meters from the 3-story building, she turned off the siren and began to slow down. The police car stopped in front of Damien. Vivian jumped out of the back seat and waved to the driver and his partner. Thanks, guys. I owe you one. Good luck, she said. Vivian turned around to her family and was met with shocked looks. What about you guys? Actually, they took my car, so I had to improvise, Vivian said. Where have you been? Were you going to miss the housewarming party? Damien asked. Vivian rolled her eyes and walked toward the house. She was in a great mood, and not even her lover's nagging would ruin this wonderful day. For the first time in years, Vivian felt at home in this unfinished building where new furniture had just been brought in. But this place was truly her own. Her whole family would be gathered under one roof, and for the first time in a long time, the woman felt happy. By the way, you were supposed to be at work, too, Vivian said snidely, showing the movers where to carry the big couch. It was your 10th grade class that had a concert in Italy near the principal's house. You got a call, but you didn't answer. I don't take work numbers on weekends, Damien mumbled, wondering what kind of reprimand he'd get on Monday when he got back to his favorite 10th grade class. The head teacher had told him not to take those slackers. But could he refuse them? It was almost impossible. Oh, he'd probably lose his bonus. But what did he have to do with it? It's the end of the year. The boys are having their last free year. Why touch them? Damien froze. Vivian snapped her fingers in front of his face. She chuckled and walked into the house. These blackouts often happen when the man was thinking about something, especially in the last year. Lillian ran into the house first and immediately rushed to the second floor, where she chose the largest and most beautiful room. True, there was nothing special in it yet, but Yuji's grandfather already had a plan to please his granddaughter. Yugi hadn't regained all of his memory, but some of it had definitely returned. He couldn't testify in court against his sister Laurel because the doctors wouldn't give him permission. However, the prosecutor still referred to his memories. However, without his help, Laurel was sentenced to 11 years in a penal colony, and all the money and the apartment returned to the owner. It must be admitted, Abby turned out to be a good doctor. The first successes in treating Yuji appeared in a couple of months, and in 6 months he already remembered his daughter. A year later, Yuji remembered almost all the events of the last 30 years of his life. However, it was very difficult to fully recover his memory. Vivian could not get her father to remember how he met her mother. Yes, and much that was before the birth of his daughter he did not remember. However, that didn't make him any less loved. Lily got used to her grandfather almost immediately. She spent a lot of time with him and often asked for help. Yugi taught his granddaughter how to make paper boats and was very happy to have a family again. He smiled sadly as he remembered the years he had spent on the streets. Damien had also made friends with his father-in-law. Though it had to be admitted, he couldn't get used to him for a long time. His quiet and arrogant demeanor kept Eugene from trusting his son-in-law. Vivian was walking up the stairs to the top of the stairs. She took Damien under her arm and pulled him to the 3rd floor. There was the largest room with a huge window and a small terrace. Vivian and Damien had chosen this place for themselves together. The woman wanted a place to relax on the terrace with flowers, and Damien dreamed of sitting there and reading books. However, their desires did not contradict each other. As soon as the door leading to the stairs slammed shut, Vivian spun in place and started laughing loudly. Damien looked at her with a smile. "Have you decided to go crazy?" he asked. "I guess so. It's just, I feel like this is the first white streak in my life. Like there's never been one before." "A lifetime-long black streak," Vivian replied. Damien slowly walked over to her and hugged her. "May the white streak be as long as the black streak," he said. Vivian reached into her bag and pulled out a framed, yellowed ship. "This is where the symbol of our happy life will hang in this room," she said. The old man took in a refugee orphan, and when she went up to the study where he wouldn't let her in. When Mrs. Zendia, the neighbor, asked if Maggie could sleep alone that night, it was necessary to confess honestly that she could not. It was frightening to look at her grandmother's empty bed, and impossible not to. The silence was ringing. The surrounding silence was cutting to the ears. Who came up with this omen of stopping the clock in a house when a person dies in it? Grandmother loved her antique clock very much. Its quiet rustle, its soft sound. When Grandma brought little Maggie here, that clock had been here for a long time. Maggie had cried. The first night, Grandma sat on her bed and began to quietly comfort her. "You see, you and I are going to live well together, like girlfriends. I've chosen the coziest corner for your bed. Doesn't the clock bother you? Do you hear it? Maggie, Maggie, Maggie." Maggie quietly nudged the pendulum and cried silently. It couldn't be that Grandma was gone. When she had been told as a 6-year-old that Mommy and Daddy were dead, she hadn't believed it for a very long time. Somewhere they must be now, which means that someday they will come. That's why she flatly refused to leave their common home. She doesn't even remember why she agreed. I guess her grandmother managed to persuade her. Some miraculous way she knew how. At first, Maggie was terribly afraid that she would be taken away by some of the strangers who had appeared in the house after Mom and Dad disappeared. There wasn't a single evil person among them. It was just that they were all complete strangers. She was afraid to even cry in front of them, let alone answer questions. When they asked her something, she didn't just keep silent, but turned away just in case. That way they would get away from her faster, stop noticing her. One day some aunt pestered her. She said she had to go to daycare tomorrow. Maggie turned away and stared at the front door, pretending not to hear anything. Instead of Maggie, the aunt answered with some meaningless nonsense. Her neighbor, Mrs. Lee with the purple curly hair. I can honestly tell you that I'm not surprised. She's a very spoiled girl from Brooklyn. No one's been seriously involved in her upbringing. And just at that moment, the front door, at which Maggie was looking, opened and a short, thin woman in blue jeans and white sneakers with blue flowers quietly entered, who heard everything, because she immediately answered something incomprehensible, though no one had time to ask her. Come on, you are such a close friend of the family to judge about it, and even more confidently express your opinion out loud. Mrs. Lee with the purple hair was loudly indignant. And I'm Maggie's grandmother, her father's mother. I haven't seen you around here, the woman replied. Grandma. Maggie shouted and rushed toward the stranger before she had time to think, just to escape immediately. "Well, hello, Maggie." She heard a voice above her, and warm hands stroked her hair. That's right, it's her daddy's mom. She has the same kind and light hands. Daddy had said so often that Maggie had the kindest and most beautiful grandmother that Maggie couldn't wait to see her. She had long been promised to be taken far away to another town to visit her grandmother. And now Grandma had come herself and was just as Papa had described. Daddy never lied. After meeting Grandma, Maggie immediately stopped being afraid of all the terrible fears. It turned out that she and Grandma had no one but each other. Maggie was glad when she learned that it would be just the two of them. "It's so good that it's just you and me, Grandma, with no strangers," the girl said. "Grandpa would have loved you a lot too. You can be sure of that," Grandma smiled. She wasn't very happy that it was just the two of them with Maggie. There were many pictures of Grandpa in the house, but all in albums and only one on the wall. It showed a young dark-haired man, cheerful and strong, sitting in a boat, and on his lap he held a little boy, a little older than Maggie. The boy was very serious, frowning and gripping the oars tightly. Maggie recognized immediately that this boy was her daddy. They had pictures of him as a child at home, too. Grandma said here they were fishing on the Potomac River. It had been some very fishy summers, and they had had a terrific vacation. And in the early fall, 2 days after returning from vacation, Grandpa was killed in the line of duty. Little Maggie was afraid to ask what those duties were. And Grandma didn't explain the further family story, sad, but also beautiful in some ways. That story the grandmother revealed to the growing Maggie later. Matthew, the girl's father, grew up and left to study in Boston. To his mother's delight and relief, he had absolutely no desire to follow in his father's footsteps. Not drawn to any dangerous service, he simply enrolled as a project engineer. Thoughtful and focused, Matthew was very suited to this specialty. Everyone around him thought so too. No one expected any adventures from the guy. But he did. He fell in love with a girl from a wealthy family. And he didn't just fall in love for a while, he really fell in love. He was like that about everything. And so was the girl Bella. Her mother and stepfather were sure that sooner or later she would marry the son of a family friend, Eugene, with whom the stepfather had a business partnership. The guy was really very shallow, had been educated in England, had come back and was making a solid contribution to his father's business. He was in his early 30s. Financial prosperity was in sight. Why not get married? Mom and stepfather at first quietly, then more and more frankly and firmly began to push student Bella to a favorable, prosperous marriage. At first she joked, perhaps too careful and long, so that the family had time to realize that her refusal is not a whim of a spoiled princess. But it was time to speak seriously. Bella inhaled a little audibly, exhaled noisily, and announced, "The thing is, I have another fiancé." "Who is he?" languidly asked her mother, secretly hoping that the beautiful daughter went to her and knows how to find the best of the possible. And Bella's mother was disappointed, extremely disappointed. The groom turned out to be a young engineer, yesterday's university graduate, who got a job in a small construction firm. Well, he should be. It's not the richest who get the most money. Family makes all the difference. But the groom's mom was the widow of some provincial policeman. And so for the sake of this almost rustic, poor guy, Mom raised her beautiful Bella with clear skin, black eyebrows, and delicate green eyes like almonds. "Love. But I had it, too," Mom said. "I loved your father when I married him, but he got involved in some obscure project and left you and me penniless. If it hadn't been for Stephen, you'd have grown up in a communal flat." Stephen himself, Mom's husband and benefactor, was brief. "Marry Eugene? It's been arranged." Mom was afraid of his strong statements, but Bella was not. She married her Matthew, and her parents kept their promise, cut her out of the family. Especially since they had another daughter growing up, little Olia. Their common daughter was Stephen, surely more successful and promising than Bella, who inherited only debts from her father. Grandmother said to Maggie, "I pass on to you as your mother told me. I add nothing of my own. If you want, you can always look up your mother's side of the family. I once thought it was wrong that they weren't told of your birth. But when your parents died, my relatives were notified, just knowing about it just in case. And deciding for myself. There was nothing to decide here. No one came for Maggie except for Ashley's grandmother. So she had no one else. Now Grandma Ashley was gone. So no one at all alone in the whole wide world. If it wasn't for Archie. You knew Grandma was sick. Yeah, I know, she's not old. My mother's a little younger than your grandmother, as you know. But a bad heart is a bad heart. It can't be helped. You've got to get on with your life, not mourn endlessly. Archie comforted Maggie. He convinced her to go to New York. What's there to catch? He's a car mechanic, albeit a novice, but a good one, with excellent references. If Maggie rented out her and her grandmother's apartment, and he added his savings, and then quickly got a job, they could easily rent a small apartment in a bedroom community in New York City, and still have something to live on. Remember, I told you about my ideas before, but you were so afraid to leave your grandmother, you were glued to her. And now there's nothing keeping you here. Now Maggie really had nothing to hold her. She wouldn't have dared to go to a strange city alone. But New York was her mom's hometown. Plus Archie would be there, and she'd be with him. Aunt Zendaya shook her head. Oh, Maggie, I don't know. I'll help you rent the apartment. I'll supervise the tenants. But it's so little, barely enough for a room in New York. It's a different price of living there, everything. You're just out of college, you have zero experience. Before you get a job, what are you going to live on? At least you're at home here. And I'll always have a bowl of soup if you need it. Oh, Aunt Zendaya, Maggie waved her off. It's just the two of us. Archie's thought it over, and he's got some savings, and he'll find a job with his qualifications. We'll live no worse off than we do here. He knows he'll have to rely on him at first. Aunt Zendaya waved her hand back and forth. She got up from her chair, walked around the room in silence, and finally said, "It's your business, Maggie. The apartment is yours alone, and in that sense there's nothing to be afraid of. But I don't like these fashionable civil marriages without a rosary. It's old-fashioned. It's good and convenient for guys. All these, let's live and see, something does not suit. We'll sort it out, and there's nothing to share. What if you live with a new one every year? And for us girls, what's good in it? Not a wife and not a bride." Aunt Zendaya continued. "It's a trial, a temporary arrangement. What hope is there for him? It would be fine if he himself settled in the city, created a base, as they call it, and then pulled you with him. But no, he decided to stick to his grandmother's apartment, to make his life easier. And maybe you had a nice place of your own. Anyway, we're all our own people." The tactless mention of Grandma could have been taken offense to, but Maggie took no offense. Grandma Ashley would have understood, she said with conviction. Of course, she understood a lot more about relationships than the other adults. Maggie knew that for some reason, if Grandma had been alive, Maggie wouldn't have dared to move so far away from her, and now it didn't matter anymore. It was as if the stars had taken it upon themselves to help Maggie and Archie. Surprisingly, they found decent long-term tenants pretty quickly, a young couple with a toddler. Maggie had prepared in advance, sorted out and neatly stacked her grandmother's wrinkled belongings. She gave it to Aunt Zendaya for safekeeping. She took only her watch with her, though she sent that too into her suitcase in a cozy box, lovingly nestled between her warm sweaters. "They're so bulky. Why do you have to carry them with you?" Archie wondered. "I'm going to hang them in our apartment in New York, so we'll have something of our own," Maggie answered. "Well, if that's the way you want them," Archie agreed generously. In New York, too. Everything worked out as planned. A one-room apartment for the right price and a job for Archie were quickly found. True, the apartment was very cramped and far from the subway, and the job on the opposite side of the city. But that didn't matter much if you didn't pick on the little things. Maggie organized her closet and hung her grandmother's clock on the wall. She went shopping, boiled some borscht at home, and sat down at her laptop. She had to look for a job. Of course, she has no experience, but in college she took first place in hairdressing and creative competitions. Maggie has diplomas, and she agrees to the most modest salary, as long as there is an opportunity to gain experience. Returning from work, Archie several days in a row caught the same picture: a clean apartment. Lunch on the stove. Focused Maggie sends her resume to the salons. "We decided not to dwell on it," Archie said. "You'd think I couldn't provide for you on my own. I blame you and drive you to work. But it's not like that at all. As far as I'm concerned, you don't have to work at all. Not while we're renting at this price, anyway. And if they raise the price, you can raise the price for your tenants. I can't do that, Maggie sighed honestly. I told you how hard it was to rent my grandmother's and my grandmother's apartment. The only thing that made me feel better was that Eugene and Natasha were really nice guys. And their son Timmy is a wonderful, healthy baby who loves to smile and sing his long songs in his crib. I couldn't let anyone worse live in our apartment. And I can't raise the price on these people. You're my favorite little fool, Archie grinned patronizingly, hugging her. Okay, I'll take care of the problems myself, but I need you not to be busy and tired, but to wait for me at home with dinner. I'm really so tired in this car service that if you also come tired from some beauty salon, then on only bought dumplings I will not last long. I'm not quite settled here yet. I'm going to have to step it up a notch if I'm going to get anywhere. Why don't you stay home for a while? We thought it'd be easier and better that way. You've done such a good job organizing it like it's our own apartment. And you can walk around the city until midnight so you don't get bored while I'm at work. Other girls wish their boyfriend would support them. And you like the workday, the job, the whimsy? Maggie was embarrassed. Indeed, she'd earn a pittance and deprive her Archie of a fresh lunch and dinner every day. If they don't squander the money, they can get by. It's not like she's going to go to the theaters and concerts. That's fine. They'll get along just fine without her earnings. Summer came, and Archie's assurance that she had nothing to work for now came in very handy. Although it was a cool, windy summer with frequent rain, it was still a beautiful summer. The city no longer seemed unprincipled and gray to Maggie when there was thick shade, fresh green in the parks. And the river didn't look so stark anymore. One day Maggie went into the Museum of Natural History and didn't notice herself spending 3 hours there. At dinner, she told Archie about it. Let's go together again this weekend. I didn't have time to look at and memorize everything. And then we'll go somewhere else. Why did we come here if we can't see anything? We came here to earn, not to spend, Archie explained condescendingly. I can see it all later, if I want to. Archie was working hard and saving money for some important plans, which he promised to tell me about later. Vivian, a neighbor on the floor, with whom Maggie had become friends, thought that Maggie was lucky to have Archie. Your husband's a hard worker. He's got a lot of determination for his age. He'll bring everything into the house, I can tell. You know how infantile guys are these days. Take my Kieran. We've had a son for 2 years, and for my husband the main thing is his friends, his company. They always have to rush to help at the first call, no matter what. His wife has other plans. She is not bored with the child. Son is always fun. Most of them are selfish. So you've still got a good one. Although you're pretty, Maggie could find someone better, not someone who wouldn't take you out, but not a sure thing. So yeah, your Archie thing is pretty good. Maggie, after Vivian had talked about her options, felt uncomfortable complaining that she was missing something. She had a very different idea of their life in the big city. She felt like they'd been together for 100 years. And Archie no longer loved her the way he used to. He comes home from work tired, often irritable over nothing, lying on the couch waiting for food, and he looks at Maggie as if she were something ordinary, as if she always had been and always would be, like a radiator. It's true that he changes at night, especially before the weekend, remembering affectionate words, promising to think of something interesting for the vacation. I guess it's the fatigue, the worry. Will he be able to achieve something in a foreign city, in a megalopolis? It's certainly hard to settle in. After all, Archie works alone for 2 people. Everything is getting more expensive so fast, and the landlord hints at a pay rise. We'll have to find a job after all. At first, Archie will grumble, but then he'll realize that it's better this way, and I'm busy. I don't have time to be bored and think of silly things. And it will be interesting, because a hairdresser is a man of art, my favorite profession. Maggie thought about it, consulted with Vivian, and decided to try another tactic of job search. Nothing comes of sending out resumes listing children's contest prizes from college. When you have no experience at all, there are probably 1,000 girls sending out 1,000 resumes at the same time. Go to the neighborhood salons yourself, Vivian advised her grandmother's old method. But in your profession, it can work. A hairdresser has to be personable. When I first saw you, I thought lucky for us that the neighbor's such a nice girl rented an apartment. So walk around. smile, and socialize. Maggie thought it might help. In the expensive luxury salon from the street, of course, will not take, but in a simple barbershop, as they have in their town at the bathhouse, quite possible. And Maggie, having hardly waited for Archie to leave for work, set off in search of happiness. There were plenty of salons and establishments with a modest barbershop sign nearby. 4 salons didn't show the slightest interest in her, but at a tiny, modest, semi-basement salon with the glamorous name Orchid, the bored brunette perked up after a brief conversation with Maggie. "Oh, I need a replacement immediately. My assistant is not a bad girl, but she has a tumultuous personal life and is unreliable. It's not about her at all. She has to be replaced all the time. The boss doesn't care which one of us works, as long as it's not at a loss. I'm really sick of this unpredictability, and it's useless to talk. I can see you're different. If I put a question to the owner, either me or Olia, he will ask her, because he knows very well who is worth what here. He doesn't pay much, so he doesn't have the nerve to count on a supermaster. It's just convenient that I live 1 floor up. I'd have looked for something better a long time ago. But it's convenient for picking up my daughter from school. It's a local neighborhood. Same grandmothers and aunts for years. The demands aren't too fancy. I'm sure you've been practicing on the same neighbors back home. Yeah, well, nothing unexpected. Leave me your phone number. I'll call you when I need to fill in. My name is Rita. I promise to get you ready." Maggie liked the confident Rose, but for some reason the air in the semi-basement Orchid seemed musty, sickly sweet, dizzy and nauseous. She politely said goodbye and hurried outside, where she barely made it to the corner of the house before vomiting into the grass. Maggie felt a little better, but suddenly she felt a strange weakness, as if all her strength had gone at once. She was even a little frightened and decided not to go home, but first to Vivian. "Via V, I think I might get a job, but it's a long shot," she said from the doorway. "Are you so pale?" Vivian marveled at the look on her face. Maggie sighed and told her what had happened to her. Vivian shook her head thoughtfully. "I don't want to scare you. It's better to test right away and eliminate the assumption. I have a pregnancy test lying around in my medicine cabinet." "What kind of test?" Maggie didn't understand. "Are you 100% sure you can't be pregnant?" "Then I'm jealous." Vivian waved her hands. "Do you think we're from the middle of nowhere?" "Of course we're using protection. Archie himself." Maggie smiled, not used to discussing such things. "Yeah, I believe every word you say," Vivian nodded. "When people say to me, 'How handsome Greg is,' I say, 'What do you want?' It's electronically verified. We were planning for later, like 5 years from now. But he had his own way. You found it, take a test and don't think about horrors in advance. Maybe there's nothing. Or maybe there is, but it'll be fine." Maggie hadn't thought to ask Vivian how best to break the news to Archie. Hints were silly, it should be direct, but at the right moment, not from the doorstep, but when Archie had eaten dinner and rested a little. She waited until nightfall. And when the lights went out, she whispered in a half-whisper, "Archie, I'm pregnant. I'm sure you are." The smells in the barbershop made me sick. Vivian gave me a test and it showed 2 stripes. "Oh, really? You're not kidding me." Archie stretched out lovingly. "You know I don't get such stupid jokes." "I'm serious. Vivian told me that they also had a baby despite the measures. It's not uncommon. I will try to edit the text, keeping its basic content and style, replacing names and cities with American ones, dividing it into paragraphs, emphasizing dialogues and eliminating phraseology. No method could be completely trusted." Maggie didn't know what to say next. She fell silent, and silence hung. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall. Why was Archie silent too? He's gathering his thoughts. Now he's going to put his arm around her, say, "Don't worry, we'll get through this. I don't see the problem. I'll take care of it." It must have been half an hour before Maggie decided to speak again. "Archie, it scares me when you don't talk like that." "Maggie, I don't mean to say it's your fault alone. So you go to the doctor tomorrow and find out how much it'll cost to get it stopped quickly. And I'll give you whatever you need from my savings." It was as if she'd heard a completely alien voice. Maggie reached out a shivering, frozen hand, fumbled for the lamp switch, and turned on the light, as if she wanted to make sure it was her Archie. It was him. And he shielded himself from the light with his hand. "Well, what have you done to me now?" "Well, you're not hysterical." "Are you going to tell me you want a baby? That doesn't make any sense. Why would we want one, especially now?" Maggie tried to catch his gaze, but he shivered with his palm and curved his mouth in displeasure. Her ability to speak suddenly returned to her. "I didn't want anyone, because I just didn't think about it. I can't abort. If I already have a child, I'll love it. My grandmother told me my father was happy when he found out I was coming. Although he and my mom had nothing at that time, he just loved her very much. So he loved their child right away. That is me. Of course, your dad's a noble knight, and I'm a scoundrel. Did you ever think that he hoped to make peace with his rich wife's family by having a child? No. And that's life, baby." Maggie silently slipped into her flip-flops, went into the kitchen, and cried with her head on the table. Whether her daddy was counting on something or not, he still wouldn't be able to clean it up quickly, so to speak. Maggie knows for a fact that daddy couldn't have done that. She carried a small photograph behind her passport cover. There, Matthew and Nellie are squatting, holding the handles on either side of a tiny little girl in a crimson jumpsuit who has just learned to walk. "Daddy, Mommy." "I don't have anyone else to support me," Maggie whispered. Stop whimpering, she heard a good-natured voice above her. "Go to bed. Tomorrow, if you're afraid, they'll take you to the doctor." "Well, I'm sorry about that. Soon you won't even remember it." "I'm not getting rid of the baby." "Of course you're in favor of creating poverty. I could have guessed that when you were picking up stray cats with kittens." "But I'm not a stray." Maggie interrupted him quietly. "Look, why don't you get some sleep, calm down, and then we'll talk sensibly in the morning. I'm tired as a dog at work, and there's drama at home. I'm going to go sleep somewhere. If you want to talk without drama, call me." Maggie watched Archie silently as he folded his things without looking at her and threw his underwear and clothes into his gym bag. "Don't worry, he'll play free wolf, cool down, and come back. He'll apologize. The main thing is to keep your tail pistol and everything with him. And first pretend to be mortally offended and convinced that perfectly well do without him," exhorted and admonished Maggie Vivian. "I don't have to pretend I'll get along just fine without him, if not fine." "You'll have to get along awfully well," Maggie assured her grimly. "Why are you so downhearted?" Vivian continued to comfort her, not very confidently. Maggie interrupted her. "I'm sorry, friend, you're the best. But don't do this. He doesn't need me. I saw it last night. I don't know why I didn't see it before. Not when I was handy, when he needed me. Aunt Zendasia was right. If I didn't have the money from selling my grandmother's apartment, he wouldn't have brought me here with him. He'd have left alone, promised to come back for me, and disappeared." Archie was gone. Maggie couldn't take it anymore and burst into tears, crying and angry at herself for not being able to hold back her tears. It was as if Vivian had read her mind. "That's right. Don't be shy with me, Cry. How much do you need? You'll calm down quicker that way. I know what I'm talking about. We fools believe we're loved, that they'll take care of us. Sometimes we're lucky not to be wrong, but often we're not." Archie never came back. Calming down, if you could call her confused state that, Maggie looked around the apartment and realized there were no things left in it for him to come back for. All the little things they had managed to acquire for the house mattered only to Maggie herself. Archie had taken his clothes. Now he was probably staying with the single Kieran, whom he had made friends with at his new job. He so enjoyed the coziness and the dinners Maggie cooked from his grandmother's recipes with imagination. Was he so scared of the baby that he was even willing to sacrifice his comfort? Maggie endured a full week and dialed his number after all. "The subscriber's phone is switched off or out of range," the mechanical voice reported. "Maybe we should go see him at work," after all, Vivian reasoned aloud, trying to dispel Maggie's confusion. "Would you like me to ask Kieran? He won't say no. He's such a chatterbox. It's not hard for him to talk man to man. At least find out how your Archie's feeling." Maggie looked up at her. She'd lost weight, her face strained. If in the last week, the already troubled green-brown eyes seemed huge on him. And like that, as if you couldn't see it yet, she said tiredly, "Maybe he's not sure yet. Do you know how cowardly they really are?" "Yeah," Maggie said with a strained smile. "I'm all out of money. I'm out of the deposit from the sale of my grandmother's apartment, which I used to pay for this place. If I keep spending that money, I won't be able to pay the landlord anytime soon. Next month already. There is, of course. But I can't." "I want to cry so badly," Maggie said tiredly. "And Archie knows how the money is, and he doesn't care." "What have you decided about the baby?" Vivian asked cautiously. "I don't know what to decide. I wouldn't forgive myself. It's not a question of the child itself, but what will live on when it's born, and I can't work yet. I have no one, Vivian. I don't even have anyone to come and babysit while I work. And I can't get rid of him. Don't look at me like that. I can't, that's all. I think it would be worse then than it is now." Vivian walked through the kitchen, looked in the spice jars, and said, "If your creep doesn't show up, you can always go home. At least there are all those aunts there who were friends with your grandmother will help you with something. But it's the last resort to go back penniless. You're still a little young. Could you have time to get a job here in St. Petersburg? Ideally officially, of course, with maternity leave and everything." Employers don't like that. When everything becomes clear, they say that a pregnant woman got a job on purpose. But they have their own truth, you have yours. You need to live, and they don't care. But with your profession and no experience, it may not work out that way. So at least you got something. I'll always buy you a meal and feed you. You won't go hungry, that's for sure. If you don't spend your paycheck but save up some money here and come back to your town with a small reserve for the first time. Or maybe you'll be lucky enough to find something decent. Then you'll stay in St. Petersburg as long as you want. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'd do if I were you. A job first, and then we'll see." Maggie thought that's what she'd do. She just did. Half an hour later, her cell phone rang. "Maggie, hi. Listen, I'm not going to tell you over the phone, but I think I have something for you," said Rita from Orchid. "Here's what the edited text might look like." Rose reported. "Our Richard wants to see you. He promised to be at the salon by about 3 p.m., so you better hurry up too." "Should I bring my papers?" Maggie asked. "Yes, I doubt he'll look at your papers right away," Rose said. "Well, take your passport just in case, and don't pretend to be a foreigner, like a Czech. It's not like I have any idea what he's going to get in his head from our unpredictable boss." Unpredictable. That's not very reassuring, Maggie thought. But there was no choice. Good thing she looked good that day. Maggie washed her hair, did her makeup thoroughly, dressed in one of her newest casual dresses, and even wore heeled sandals, even though she usually wore more comfortable shoes. By 3 o'clock, she was at the salon. The director had to wait another half hour. Maggie was having coffee with Rose and one of the clients from the next door, a bright, fresh-faced, red-haired, cheerful lady. "The bosses aren't late, the bosses are late, girls," she announced, making funny grimaces. She entertained Maggie and Rose with amusing stories. It wasn't boring at all. But when the principal did arrive, the cheerful client quickly said goodbye and left. Margaret, instead of gossiping, would have cleaned the place up for once. I'm not talking about superficial cleaning. I'm talking about real cleanliness. I can't believe you don't have time. "I can tell from the receipts that I have time," he said instead of greeting, without anger, with lazy irritation. Richard was a thick, stocky, middle-aged man in a brightly colored Hawaiian shirt that was a little tight around the stomach. "Richard, have a cheerful outlook on life. Is something wrong?" "Just yesterday I was your smarty pants girl," Rose said with a smile. "Is this the girl you were telling me about?" He changed the subject. "Yes, that's Maggie, a certified hairdresser with diploma certificates. Let's give it a shot. This girl really needs a job. She's just dying for a job. She's serious, she won't ask for time off. Right, Maggie?" Yes, Maggie confirmed, trying to be convincing. Here's what the edited text might look like. "Hello, please take me on probation," Richard said. Maggie's girlfriend brown-eyed. "I'm blonde," he hummed, giving Maggie a friendly, quick glance. "But the thing is, I don't need another hairdresser. I'd also try to get an experienced one and see if she's any better than these. I'm not messing with you." "Why did you ask me to come?" Maggie asked, confused. "Rose was very complimentary about you. I wanted to see if you'd be a good fit. I have a restaurant besides this place. I need another waitress now, a pretty and smart one." "Is it urgent?" "I mean, people are hiring," Maggie said. "I don't have much time, and I don't really want to waste time. If it suits you, you'll make money. The tips are pretty good over the summer, as far as I know. We'll see in the fall. I'll tell you right away, I won't make it official. It's not profitable for me. I have a lot of such establishments. In the fall, there will be fewer tourists. Maybe we'll have to fire half of them. It's a seasonal job, as usual. I'm on my way there right now. I can take you with me. See if you like it. Then we can talk about shift pay." "Yeah, thanks for the offer." "Sure, I'll go," Maggie agreed right away. What's the point of acting out in a situation like this? How long would she look for a job in her specialty before her position really became apparent? Would she ever find one? She could end up with nothing. At least there's a chance. Rose nodded at her behind Richard's back and waved her hand affirmatively. It's the right thing to do. And before Maggie knew it, she was already working in Violet for the 4th week. Yes, that was the name Richard and his partner Pete had. The restaurant was in the same semi-basement as the Orchid, only larger. There was 1 cook and an assistant and 2 waitresses per shift. One of the girls had recently graduated from university and decided to change the job she'd held on to while she was a student. Maggie was hired in her place. The restaurant was quite cozy, frequented, inexpensive, and the place was quite lively. The food was good. Another plus at work, they fed, of course not the same as the clients, simpler and cheaper. Pasta or potatoes with a meat portion, wieners or a chicken leg. At first Maggie was very happy, no need to spend on food on weekdays, again saving money. But more and more often there were days when every trip to the kitchen for an order became a feat for her. The mere smell of food made her nauseous. Not even the most appetizing dish from the banquet menu, let alone a company meal. Maggie worked shifts 2 days a week from 11 to 11 p.m. And you'd never guess in the morning how the shift would go. You'd fly from morning till night and chew on cabbage, carrots, and apples all day. Or barely crawl, holding onto the wall and trying not to look at the food, coming to the kitchen for an order. The doctor at the women's clinic, where Maggie registered for temporary registration, explained she has toxicosis. It happens a lot, but it's not a big deal. It should pass soon. I wish it would go away soon, Maggie thought. When the cook Vince is on shift, she's more relaxed. He doesn't notice anything. Like all the guys, thinking it's not a big deal, the girl didn't sleep well. But Sarah, or Sarah Lindsay as she called herself, looked at her suspiciously, as if she'd guessed it all long ago. Maggie tried not to think about it, remembering her friend Vivian's admonition. "You need to take care of your nerves now, or you'll have a lot of trouble later with a nervous child. It's just a job. You do it and you go. You don't care what anyone thinks." Vivian herself knew how to do that. She'd recently gotten out of maternity leave, returned to her accounting department, and talked about her boring boss with a laugh, no hard feelings. Maybe it was a good thing the heat was a rarity in New York that summer. It was hard to bear with the humidity here. Or was it just Maggie now? But one day on the shift it got unbearable. Nothing. It would soon be over. She ran into the locker room, behind which was the restroom, and tore off the top 2 buttons of her white work blouse to keep it from getting dirty. As she was about to get up and go to the gym, she heard behind her, "You don't make any sudden movements, girl. There are only 2 tables. Natalie can handle it without you. Let's make some peppermint tea. It helps. I've got a lot of mint growing in my garden. I'll give it to you at home if you want it. Ginger tea helps with that too, and you should eat it. You should eat more often and sleep longer." Sarah looked at Maggie without laughing, but also without pity, with calm understanding and sympathy. For some reason Maggie felt not scared, but much relieved that she had punctured herself after all. In 10 minutes in the kitchen, while she drank mint tea, she told Sarah Lindsay her whole story. "The usual story," she said. "Svet, are you going to take the groceries?" Pete asked behind her back. "Ah, hello, Svetlana Borisovna," Sarah Lindsay in turn asked in a deliberately mocking tone. Maggie even forgot that she felt sick and realized with sober horror that Pete could have heard their conversation. This companion of Richard's, young, thin, and noiseless, frightened her very much for some reason. Unpleasant, always coming unheard, such was his gait. With cooks still sometimes greets, even something else will say. And waitresses in general about the furniture, even a word never dignifies never. Maggie jumped up at his discovery and happily clung to the elbow of Natalie, who had appeared in the kitchen. "Oh, Natash, let's go for a second." "Come on, what did you get out of Natalie?" As soon as they were out of the door, you'd think a little bit in the kitchen. There's not a full house in the auditorium. That Pitlick's probably the main one, and he's just acting like it. In the evening, Richard arrived in another Hawaiian shirt, and with a particularly heavy smell of booze for Maggie. He called Maggie. In the room, accountant kitchen, office of the incoming accountant calculator. Examined the girl squeamishly and tiredly held out an envelope. "Their payment for the month." "I check everything honestly." "You don't work anymore," he said. "Why?" Maggie asked with just her lips. How insolent modern girls are, especially from the suburbs like you. What makes you think you have the right to lie and set someone up when you've been stupid enough to get pregnant? Something will happen to you at work, and you will go to some labor inspectorate. You will tell how the bastard director did not register you for work, exploited you, and you will demand maternity money. I will not scold you and scare you, so that you do not immediately faint to me. I'm just asking you nicely for now, be quiet, and don't try to pull something like that. He was almost friendly, without anger. A smooth, lazy voice. Maggie had a lot of things she wanted to say, but she kept quiet. She wanted to throw his money at him, but she took the envelope silently. It would come in handy. It wasn't even for her. "Let's really report the bastard," Vivian suggested. "You want me to report him for poisoning at his diner?" "Yeah, they'd just fire Sarah, Lena, or Vince." Maggie waved her head. "Yeah, that's a no-go." "Oh, we'll get the IRS on him. I'll tell them they didn't give him a check twice for service, or the health department, or the fire department. I mean, what's the one thing he can't get enough of?" "Vivian, I won't feel better if he feels worse," Maggie admitted. "I would," honestly, said Vivian. "They wouldn't let her rest in her own apartment after work," Kieran's husband muttered. "They're all intrigue. Kieran couldn't tell whether he was joking or serious. The next day, Maggie slept most of the day. She woke twice, drank strong tea in the kitchen, and went back to bed. Nothing wanted to do, nothing to think about. It was as if a dark curtain had fallen over her eyes. In the evening, Vivian rang the doorbell. "Come to our place." "Oh, come on, Kieran will be nagging you and me." "He's calling you himself. He wants to tell you something. He didn't send it through me," Vivian announced. Kieran was in the kitchen eating soup from a deep bowl. "Maggie, I found out something for you. Maybe it'll be good for you. My buddy Eugene finishing. He just did a remodel on a private house in the suburbs for a grandfather. It's a nice house, but he lives alone. He's taken a liking to his colleague. He sees that he's a normal, honest guy, and shared that he would rent a room to a woman, if for the usual household help and to be his companion, so even for free. You know, for errands and conversation. That's the deal. A favor for a favor. His living conditions are very good. He's not picky about cleaning and cooking. He told me so himself." "Maybe he's crazy," Maggie interrupted incredulously. "Eugene says exactly normal, the right grandfather. Just alone and with money. He says he can always get it through an agency, but he doesn't trust them very much. That's why he's asking everyone he knows to recommend him. I thought of you right away." "Lying again?" Maggie asked tiredly. "Suddenly a good man, he expects a quiet old age. And suddenly I'm having a baby, and if I find a job again, how will I have time to do his errands? Then you'll have to pay for the room like you're supposed to. And listen, Maggie, don't confuse me. I'm not Sherlock Holmes. I'm a slow thinker. Come on." And Eugene will tell him honestly that this is your situation. It's probably the right thing to do. Let him decide for himself. Yes or no? Maggie nodded. Even Kieran wanted to help her. She'd thought he hated her for hanging around their house. That didn't make sense. I don't think this is going to work. But you have to say thank you and pretend you're hopeful. So she did. Kieran went to his Eugene. Vivian exhaled noisily and suggested, "Let's have some cherry pie. We'll sit up for the night." Vivian suggested, "If you're really hungry, we could do it once. What do you think, Maggie? Maybe something good could come out of this. Go and see it. You've got nothing to lose. Just take a good look at the landlord. He's a cunning old man. Instead of hiring a housekeeper for a salary, he's looking for a tenant who'll do the same duties for a room. Don't be shy. Just ask directly what exactly you have to do. Maybe it's a lot of work. What? It's easier to rent a room for money than to do it all every day. Honestly, I couldn't do it. Sometimes I'm ready to throw something heavy at my chief accountant for her nagging. And there's a million reasons for nagging. But it's still worth a look." On his first day off, Kieran took Maggie to meet the grandfather who rented out the room. According to him, the grandfather was not confused by Maggie's story. He didn't even ask anything. Vivian had planned to contact her husband and friend, thinking of a good excuse to go out with the child in the country. But the baby was sick, feverish and cranky, and they didn't have time for a walk. For some reason, Maggie imagined a large wooden house in a clearing like merchant estates from movies about old life. But the house turned out to be brick and faced with stone without any curlicues, but very stylish and beautiful. It was surrounded by a small garden, a few apple and cherry trees without a trace of beds and flower beds. This through the fence could be seen at once. The fence was not a blank brick wall, but a wrought metal one. The elegant gate was ajar, but Kieran was too shy to enter and called on his cell phone. "Greg, this is Kieran from Eugene. I brought Maggie's girl to see your room." "Ah, good, let's go inside, Maggie." As they walked along the stone-paved path toward the house, the front door opened, and the owner himself appeared, holding a large and very shaggy white dog by the collar. From under his bangs, he was scrutinizing Maggie and Kieran. "This is Archie. He's peaceful. As long as he doesn't attack us," Master said. Master continued, "So don't be afraid of him for a minute if you're not going to attack him. And I'm Greg." One had to look closely at his face to realize that the host was well into his 70s, covered with a grid of wrinkles where deep and sharp, where thinner and smaller. His gaze was quick and sharp, not senile, but it was softened by the rays of wrinkles near his eyes. "Not mean," Maggie breathed out quietly. "And if you didn't look at his face, you'd never think he was an old man." He had the posture of a middle-aged man with a gaunt figure and no hint of decrepitude. Completely graying silver hair was cut very short, a neat beard. Greg invited them into the house. So respectable on the outside, the house turned out to be cozy, but a little unusual on the inside. Of course, it was obvious from the many signs that a woman's hand had not been here for a long time, although the owner obviously keeps order. But the main thing was that the house was as if several different eras had come together. So different was the furniture, even the bedspreads and curtains. In the spacious hallway on the first floor, XXI century, and in the living room as if the 19th. Even Maggie, who knew a little about antiques, could tell that the furniture was antique. She faltered, "I guess it's rude to look at everything so closely." Kieran took a seat on the edge of the guest sofa at his host's suggestion and kept modestly quiet. "I suppose you want to see the room at once, Maggie?" Greg asked. "Have you already decided that I'm the right person for you?" Maggie was surprised and confused. "Have you decided that I'm not the right person for you?" The landlord laughed. "Don't be so quick to judge. Let's see the room. It's right here on the first floor. I myself live on the second floor. There's an office and a bedroom. The rest of the space is abandoned. It's just a bunch of old archives. I'm sorting it out, but it's a little light. If you'd like to keep me company, I'd really appreciate it. Of course, if you're interested." Here's how it went down. Greg opened the light beige silent door. "This is the room. Come in, Maggie." A square room, the window looked out into a cozy corner of the garden. It seemed very warm and cozy. though the only furniture was an old chest of drawers, a small table with a mirror, and a bed. "We'll find a closet for dresses," said the owner. "Curtains. If you don't like them, change them. The main thing is not to tear down the load-bearing walls, and the rest is negotiable, solvable." Maggie remembered the most important thing. "Greg, I like the room. You just tell me all your conditions in detail at once. You told Eugene that you're renting the place out for household help, and I'd like to know what my duties will be. I'm conscientious. But you know I'm having some difficulties." "What a businesslike girl you are," smiled the owner. "Your difficulties, as you put it, do not interfere with me. Maybe it will sound strange what I will say, but try to understand. I know you have no one. I don't have anyone either. I could hire a pro housekeeper and have, but I don't want an uncomfortable stranger's professional servant person in the house anymore. I don't have a need for the house to be perfectly cleaned, like for a magazine, and to be serviced like a luxury hotel. I need a live-in person in the house. I like you a lot, and I don't like all people. Household chores without the fanaticism. The same things you'd do if I were your dad or your grandfather living under the same roof. A little bit at a time, depending on your mood. Just so you're sure, this isn't charity. This kind of work is worth about the price of a house. If you help with the archives, that would be the most wonderful thing. I'll pay you like a secretary for that." Maggie had imagined her conversation with the landlord differently, and she had imagined him differently while she was on her way here. It seemed suspicious that things are working out so well. All right, she'll probably find out the pitfalls later. Here's the edited text. "Greg, when can we move into the room?" Maggie asked. "If your friend Kieran will drive up and down to get your things, you can go today," Greg said. "I'll give you some money to stop by and buy us dinner and a housewarming party." "Yes, I'll make dinner," Maggie promised. "Let's go ask Kieran." It turned out that archives were not dusty and boring papers that made me sleepy. Documents are a very interesting thing, like reading a screenplay. Only it was all real. Especially the diaries. They were alive, like enchanted narrow books. When there were no computers and not everyone had a typewriter, people simply wrote down their thoughts with a pen on paper, and even earlier, they transcribed them into ordinary school notebooks, or beautiful thick volumes that contained whole lives. And people had enough time for that, despite the fact that there were almost no household appliances. And life itself was no easier than it is now. As Greg said, life had simplified and lost a lot. No, there's a lot of good things now, but the old good things had better stay. It was very interesting with him in general. Vivian was worried that Maggie was bored out there on the outback with her old grandfather and called for her to come and visit them more often on weekends. Maggie was happy to come, and she took a couple of walks around New York with little Greg, and then she was just as happy to come back. "Oh, all right, my bunnies, I've got to go home," she said last Saturday, surprised at herself. With Vivian, she already thought of this house and the room in it as her real home, the one she had lived in long ago, and it was as if her grandmother's pictures had always hung on that wall opposite her bed. Where did Greg put them? "Not picking on you, Grandpa?" Vivian asked. "About the variety on the menu or anything else? Not putting things in the wrong place, not neat enough or lazy?" "What kind of complaints can grandfathers have?" Maggie laughed. "Probably like my Kieran, only twice as much because of his age." "To be honest, it's hard for me to imagine Greg as a picky old man," laughed Maggie. "As it happens, I don't do anything heavy at all. But I do the same basic things I did when I lived with my grandmother. Dinner, simple cleaning, and Greg takes away my cleaning supplies. If you imagine I should be tired by now. And Greg always spoils me with goodies," she continued. "He says he bought it for himself, but he barely touches it. Vivian, he's not a typical grandfather." There was a story, Maggie said. There lived a regular old Soviet professor, invented various innovations for the Soviet industry and for the military. And he had two favorite students, both of whom had been working with him for many years, and shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. He started some serious project and hoped very much to advance it. One of his students worked with him on the technical part of the project, and the other one, more persuasive and dodgy, ran through all sorts of instances to get funding, or some permits. "For me, these technical scientific works are just a dark forest," Maggie admitted. "I only realized one thing about them: they are very long. and the result is not always as you expect. And while these companions were working, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the funding ran out. Soon there would be nothing to travel on. It was unclear who would pay for the work in general, even if from home all the valuable things in the pawn shop. And when everything was ready, one of the student companions disappeared. The one who was a punching bag, I guessed. Yeah, that's what happened, Maggie nodded. Took all the developments with him and took off. That's the way it was going. He went to the West, patented his invention, provided for himself and his children for life. And these two honest martyrs of science professors almost had a stroke. He was ill for a long time, barely survived, and when he got back on his feet, his wife also took him to the States, persuaded him. She had a close relative living there and married very successfully. And the second student stayed here in New York. Here is the edited continuation of the text. At first he thought he'd go to sleep, Maggie continued, and then somehow it all worked out. Talent, he does find a loophole. He met the right person from the New Russians, but very smart. He began to work for this man, a whole production he thought up and earned good money back in the 90s, and then also received an inheritance from the States. It turns out that his favorite friend, a professor, still had time to work there but for himself, said Maggie. And the professor had no children. He wrote such a will, half of the property to his wife, half to his student and colleague Greg, where I live. This old archive we're going through right now is the professor, she explained. Greg dragged it everywhere with him, since it was left to him, and his last name. The antique furniture was left to him. The professor and his wife could have sold it before they left. It's not cheap. But the professor wanted to leave at least something valuable as a memento of himself to his student. He felt he'd let him down with his earnings and recognition. And when Greg bought the house, he moved everything there. And now he lives surrounded by those memories, Maggie continued. And the archive wants to dismantle and hand over some of his favorites, as if he owed it to his teacher, so that someone here would remember him. That's the life of people, Vivian waved her head. Even intelligence isn't a guarantee that you'll live a problem-free life. Listen, why is your Greg alone if there are no heirs around such a wealthy grandfather? So you're right. He's got no one. There's something about him. Unless some auntie's got her hands on him. Vivian, he doesn't mention that at all. I don't ask, said Maggie. Maybe if he asked me something personal, I would. But he doesn't ask me either. I think he's embarrassed. He's been brought up to mind his own business. It's complicated with intellectuals, Vivian confirmed with a knowing look, as if she talked to professors every day. Maybe on the contrary, it's easier to live like that, if you follow all these rules? Vivian thought aloud. I won't make predictions, so as not to jinx it, but so far you seem to be lucky. You even look prettier, even though you're digging through dusty archives. Yeah, I looked like you when I moved in, didn't I? Maggie agreed. Look, I'm not an intellectual, I'll ask you. Have you heard from Artem? Vivian, I would have told you first. I don't have anyone in New York besides you, Bones and Greg. Greg rarely forgot anything, and now, when he volunteered to help Maggie peel apples for jam, it turned out that he forgot his glasses in the office, probably left them on the keyboard of his laptop. I'll be right there. Let me run in myself. I want to run up the stairs, Maggie said. She had only been in the office a few times. It was Greg's diocese. As he put it, I'm the master and manager here. Occasionally he'd do a little rearrangement, rearranging the books on the shelves or some figurines. Now on his antique bureau desk next to his laptop, besides his glasses, a chessboard with bone chess and a small photograph in a thin wooden frame had been left behind. Maggie hadn't noticed any photos in the office before, at least not in prominent places. In the black and white amateur photo, a little girl with 2 ponytails on top of her head is lying on the sand in a swath of sea surf, laughing and hugging a large striped bouncy ball. Maggie remembered every detail of that photo very well. She had one just like it in her backpack, in the same folder with her passport, diploma, and the few expensive photos. Greg, where did you get that photo of the girl at sea? Maggie asked, forgetting her embarrassment as she went down to the kitchen and handed the landlord her glasses. That's the picture I took. I was into photography, Greg replied, looking anxiously into Maggie's face, as if listening to her strange mood. That's my daughter, Nellie. Maggie looked at the picture of little Nellie hugging a large bouncy ball, and her voice trembled slightly. I carry a picture like that with me. It came here with me too. That's my mom, Nellie. Greg nodded sadly. Yes, Nellie Vitalievna was my wife. A good memory is far from always a blessing. She's a curse sometimes. Memories came flooding back. The beautiful Angela, whom he had adored until their last day together, had suddenly become a complete stranger. She looked even more beautiful, but it was a manicured, magazine beauty that was scary to touch. I don't want the child to flip back and forth, Angela said in her gentle voice. It will be easier for her to forget you and get used to a new father. Vitaly takes good care of her and wants me to call him Daddy. She'll have everything you could never give her. Do you know how much Nellie loves me? Greg asked painfully. You dared such a despicable fiction to make a child feel betrayed by her own father. She had already stopped caring. Children forget things quickly, Angela replied. When she's an adult, she'll understand me as a woman. If you come up with the idea of showing up, it will only be worse for her. Greg sighed. Yes, you've studied me pretty well. I won't tell my daughter that her mother easily denigrated her father. At least let her mom stay good to her. Thank you, Maggie said. I knew you'd understand, Greg. I'm not filing for child support. I know how hard this is for you. Thank you, he chuckled through gritted teeth. He turned and walked away. I didn't know where, just away. He didn't recognize anything else, and he'd never looked for anyone. He himself could no longer answer who he was protecting, more his daughter or himself, and he made a terrible mistake. Had he found his daughter in time, there would have been someone to support her when her mother had turned her away because his Nellie had chosen an unfavorable husband. And Maggie's granddaughter would have had someone to support her and his son-in-law's sainted mother. Maybe Maggie's only real grandmother would still be alive if her heart had paid for serious treatment. But history does not bear the subjunctive mood. As his teacher and colleague used to say, now you have to move on and live a long time, because soon there will be another tenant in the house who will have to be taken care of for a long time, until he can take care of himself. And to live long, easy and pleasant when you have someone to live for. Vivian's voice was a little strained, and she didn't call in the evening as usual, but on her lunch hour. Maggie, would you mind if I came straight over after work today? Yeah, nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. Just in the mood to see you and chat. There's some little things I need to tell you. Yes, come over, of course, Maggie said. Especially since Grandpa's going to a class reunion at the Institute, and he's worried about how we're going to be alone for so long. What if we need something in his absence, and he's not here? I'll at least reassure him that we won't miss him. Oh, great. Considering all the traffic, I'll be at your place by 8 p.m., Vivian promised. Maggie sent her grandfather a wet asphalt suit for the weekend, tied his tie, approved his gentlemanly image, and escorted him to the meeting. He waved a long time after the cab. Back at the house, Maggie put on her cash and went out into the garden with it. In the far sunny corner under the apple trees, unnoticeable from the road, they had a real nest. Grandfather had hung a baby cocoon hammock there for Nellie. It seemed to Maggie that her daughter loved to lie there and watch the sun bunnies playing in the apple leaves. She hummed softly in her own language. And then she would fall asleep and sleep soundly. Whatever sounds came from the road, the clever dog Archie, who knew not to bark now, sat nearby and just breathed noisily. There, too, at arm's length, stood a small, elegant garden table and 2 armchairs. Grandfather and Maggie had been sitting there for a month, since the middle of May, at 12 o'clock, rocking Nellie and listening to her hum. She's going to have a beautiful voice, Grandpa laughed in a whisper, raising his index finger to the sky. And not for nothing did she go to the opera and operetta. When in October in the city and in nature became somehow, especially Petersburg, without shelter and dreary, Grandpa Greg came up with an entertainment for Maggie. These are the theaters you like, he asked. Maggie didn't know which one she liked, or if she liked them at all. I've never been to one before, she said shyly. In our town there was nothing but the House of Culture. And here I didn't have time. Sometimes they brought some performances to the House of Culture, but I was never particularly interested in it. I see. What would be interesting? did not lag behind grandfather. I like music, Maggie admitted. Not electronic music for disco, but beautiful music, which is good for thinking or remembering something. And Grandpa took a season ticket to the Mariinsky Theater, and he so mesmerized Maggie that grandfather gladly renamed it for himself in the Mariinsky, and she felt the baby's movements there for the first time. The ultrasound showed it was a girl. Maggie knew for sure. A girl listens to music, swoons along with it during opera arias and dances to the front. Can you tell I'm making this up? Maggie used to say to her grandfather, but Nellie liked Queen of Spades best of all. He looked strangely and was silent for about 5 minutes, as if he were talking to himself, but he couldn't say it aloud. He only glared. Maggie realized only then that she had not told him how she had decided to name her girl at once, as she had already called her. Nellie was born in February, on a windy, blizzardy night. Balloons and flowers greeted them from the maternity hospital by 3 people: Grandpa, Vivian, and Kieran. Kieran drove them home, and it wasn't until their friends had left after a small buffet that Grandpa Greg sat down across from Maggie and asked, "Maybe you should let Nellie's father know she was born after all? What do you think?" "Grandpa, you haven't asked anything about him at all for so long. I thought you never would. You don't want to know anything about him?" "I just saw that you didn't want to talk about him. It's a day like this. Maybe you'll see things differently now." "The trouble with people like you is that you judge others by your own judgment," said Maggie. "You're right in some ways, but don't forget that I'm old. I've learned a few things and gotten over my naivete. Just bring me up to speed, at least briefly, while our girl is asleep." And Maggie did. To her immortal surprise, it was not at all hard for her to tell her grandfather about Archie and how easily he'd walked away from her, as if retelling a movie or a novel. It didn't have the slightest relevance to her anymore. She has a different life with other people in charge. Grandpa agreed with Maggie. Everyone who should know about Nellie's birth had already been notified. It turned out that it only seemed to Maggie that the recent past had evaporated completely. Vivian tiptoed over, looked at the sleeping Nellie, and said, sitting down on the edge of the chair, "Maggie, you'll have to forgive me in advance, please. I'm a fool to admit it." "Don't scare me with your preambles," Maggie said. She had almost no doubts about what she was going to talk about. "We had a big corporate retreat at work, the company's 20th anniversary. Shashliks in the evening scattered on the bumps to talk. Well, we have a purely female company gathered on the open veranda of all ages from 30 to 55, and there was the usual conversation about how hard it is to raise a child alone, that say it is better not to dare. In general, it's always poverty and problems. And somehow everyone fell into such pessimism, strange for a corporate party, that I wanted to tell something good. I mean, it's not always that bad. So I told Maggie the story of how she found her grandfather. I didn't even give her name, but I told them she was my friend. The girls were surprised, happy for her and her daughter, and cheered up. You'd think that would be the end of it. No way. A day later, Sunday, the doorbell rings. Maggie's ex is on the doorstep, looking anxiously for her. I let him in. Of course, I'm not being rude. Or rather, I was just confused by surprise and forgot I should have been harsh. "This is a phenomenon," I said. Here he began to me, obviously according to the prepared scenario, say, he realizes that I consider him a scoundrel, and he fully agrees. He is a scoundrel, but only now he has realized everything, and other things in the same vein. Probably watched a couple shows as a guide. I sit there nodding, pretending to be touched by his remorse, and he sings to me that he would have apologized to Maggie a long time ago if she hadn't changed her phone number and location. I lost track of her, you see. "I've only just decided to ask you now. I was so ashamed to show up," he said. I was even too lazy to ask him tricky questions. I was so disgusted. He thinks I'm a fool. No, I do not claim to be a smart woman, but not to this extent. I don't know how to get rid of him. As luck would have it, Kieran was out fishing with Eugene. If only it were that easy. Archie started begging me. "Give me an address, at least give me a phone number." So I blurted it out. I've got my own life and my own business. I don't have time to deal with other people's problems. We haven't talked to each other since we moved away. We were just roommates. Maybe Maggie even went home. Go back to your town if that's what you want. He didn't believe me for a second. Don't lie to me, kid. I ain't done nothing wrong to you, he started. He's angry and about to threaten me, even though it's not good for him. I was lucky the fishing trip didn't work out and Kieran came home early. So Kieran kicked him out, talked to him in the street once, made him promise not to come to us. Vivian paused, took a big sip of her cooled coffee, stroked Olaf's arm, and without waiting for Maggie to comment, continued. I'm just convinced I was convinced from the beginning that his appearance had something to do with my chatter. And he heard about you at the corporate party, that you're doing well, so he decided to try his luck and get a big piece of the action. It seems like a big city, but in such cases you realize that Cocoran is small. It turns out that someone always sees something, hears something, and passes it on to the wrong person. And I'm an accountant. I'm close to the personnel department. I'm friends with our personnel officer, Bella. I told her the situation, asked her to look in the profiles where the husbands of those girls who were sitting with us in the company, and listen to my story. We got in, looked, it didn't take long. Only 7 girls were married. And my hunch was right. Kathy in sales has Omega Lux service on her husband's profile, just like your Archie. You said the name, and I remember things like that. Remember when we were laughing? Why is there a C in Omega Luxury? And then it turned out that it's a designation of the Viborg district, and there are other Omegas. Here is the most likely version. That Archie is a buddy of Kathy's husband, and she told the story from the corporate party in front of him. And this goose, of course, recognized himself and you. It's too much of a match. Didn't I mention you were my roommate the other day? Maggie, I'm sorry, and be aware that he might show up, Vivian warned. Wow, Vivian, you're really something. Maggie smiled, trying to make her smile as serene as possible. You've made such a detective out of nothing, even going into the personnel records. It's not your fault. You couldn't have foreseen anything, you just told me in the mood. I've always loved hearing other girls' stories, too. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. If you're not gossiping, not saying mean things behind your back, but just talking about a person, thank you for not being mad at me. I would understand if you scolded me. Are you going to do anything about it? What do you mean? Maggie didn't understand. Stuff my stuff in a suitcase and run off somewhere? No one came to see me. Even if Archie somehow found out where I lived, there was no way he'd come here. Unless you said it was a threesome. Maybe he's picturing a mansion with columns, an alarm system, a panic button, and a couple of grim bodyguards. I didn't mention that, Vivian exhaled with relief. Oh, I even said that you have a gorgeous dog, a South Russian sheepdog. By the way, this breed is considered unpredictable and aggressive. Sorry, Olaf. By the way, you do have an alarm system, don't you? Richard returned home lively, happy to see old friends. He joked, retold stories of his classmates, sent greetings from them to his granddaughter and great-granddaughter, and announced that he had missed them. Maggie didn't tell him about Vivian's accident. It wasn't right to worry if he was the only one who would worry about her and Sarah. He needed to be taken care of, too, and there was no one else to do that but her. Sure, she was scared at first, but only a little, and at the very first moment. It's clear that Archie is not a villain, but an ordinary selfish guy. Absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Maggie will think of something if he shows up. A month later, Maggie had almost forgotten Vivian's warning. She had no time to think about unpleasant things. Her daughter Sarah was growing up. She was already sitting up in her crib, trying to sit up even in the soft cocoon chair. When she saw Olaf, she was happy and stretched her arms to him, trying to run them into his shaggy hair. Don't worry, Richard said reassuringly. Olaf understands perfectly well that it's a puppy. Vivian came almost every weekend with her granddaughter and sometimes with Kieran. But Maggie also wanted to suddenly go to Peter. Grandpa was supportive. And I still wonder how you are still not bored. At your age, solitude is usually hard to bear. The baby's over 6 months old. It's time you got out into the world. Go out with Vivian, even if it's just a carefree summer cafe. And Mommy needs to rest too. Why don't you find the milk and I'll do it without you? Fine and feed. Good girl, praised Richard. I am amazed at your knowledge in different areas. What did you think? I secretly read literature about children and control the process of growing and education. Grandpa grinned. So Maggie went to Vivian's. They did not sit in an outdoor cafe and walk together through the zoo, but still had a great time. They said they'd be coming here with Sarah very soon, showing her bigger animals than Olaf. She'd definitely be interested. They talked about how, when Sarah gets a little older, Maggie is going to open a little beauty parlor. Grandpa wants to help her start a business she likes, and it would just be great if Vivian would agree to do the bookkeeping. They did 3 laps around the zoo. Olaf didn't want to leave. When we managed to get him out, we bought ice cream and sat down with him on a bench in Alexander Park. Maggie took a bite of ice cream with pleasure and heard a half-forgotten familiar voice from the side. Maggie Schenk. She shuddered. It seemed to her that Vivian had, too. Olaf was running around the flower bed, eating ice cream on the run. Archie stepped out of the mottled shade of a tree and stood in front of them. Maggie Schenk. "Hello, Maggie," he said to her. "We have to go," Vivian said. "We're late, let's go." "Wait for me just a little while," Maggie heard her own carefree voice. "I'm interested." "It won't take long. I'm listening." The last words were meant for Archie. "Where's our daughter?" he asked, making a worried face. "We don't have anything ours," Maggie Reshetniak explained amicably. "I'm sorry if you can. I need you and your daughter. It just took me a long time to realize it. I'd do anything for you. If you'll let me try to start over. Vivian told you I was looking for you." Olaf ran around the flower bed, eating ice cream on the run. Archie stepped out of the mottled shade of a tree and stood in front of them. Maria Schenk. "Hello, Marina," he said to her. "We have to go," Vivian rushed over. "We're late, let's go." "Wait for me literally just a little bit." Maggie heard her own carefree voice. "I'm interested. It won't take long. I'm listening." The last words were meant for Archie. "Where's our daughter?" he asked, making a worried face. "We don't have anything ours," Maggie Reshetniak explained amicably. "I'm sorry, if you can. I need you and your daughter. It just took me a long time to realize it. I'd do anything for you. If you'll let me try to start over. Vivian told you I was looking for you." Vivian stood aside by the flower bed and listened. Olaf didn't even pull her back, jumping around. Maggie grinned slightly, wrinkled her nose. "Very, very theatrical. I have nothing to forgive you. It's been and gone. Then it had to be. Thanks for the daughter. She's beautiful. How did it happen?" "Deep," said Archie with reproach and admiration at the same time. "You look just Hollywood something else. Or it's really time for different." "I don't hold a grudge against you, Archie. And I'm not filing for alimony. Don't worry. You'll keep all your savings," Maggie continued in the same peaceful tone. "Maggie, don't do this to me. You can't have forgotten everything so quickly. I know you. It wouldn't have been you. People don't change that fast. And we have a daughter, and you won't even let me look at her. I know you found your grandfather, but that's not the father. I'm not giving up until you give me a chance." Now he's going to play the macho man who decided to fight for his love. Maggie rose from the bench, walked slowly around Archie, stroked his shoulder lightly, made sure he took it as a good sign, and said in the same secure, peaceful and calm voice, "People change. That's how quickly people change when circumstances force them to. I know you're aware of my financial changes, so you're under no illusions. I'm glad I wasn't married to you at the time of my grandfather's arrival. You can find a much better option with an inheritance, even with a child. One more piece of advice. If you decide to look for me or my daughter, in any way to let me know about myself, you know who, what, and how in the 90s earned a living, with whom you had to communicate. My grandfather, and now I have the appropriate connections. My grandfather owes a lot to the influential Mr. Smith, if that name means anything to you. A man like that doesn't withdraw his protection for no reason. They can always be called upon to get rid of unwanted nuisances like you, Archie. It's nothing personal, but consider it a sign of forgiveness." Maggie breathed angrily into his ear and staggered back just in case. She turned and walked across the lawn toward the zoo. Now it's going to disappear from the horizon, Vivian said. Listen, I didn't expect this from you. You've really changed, haven't you? I felt that I wasn't alone in the world and I changed. I can see that. Maggie. Who's Smith? You never told me about him. Is he the guy your grandfather invented the production lines for? I don't even know his name. Let's go with Jock. Jock Smith is a vaudeville authority figure for Archie, okay? You just made him up. Passers-by turned around, some irritated, but most smiled. What fun and infectious laughter from those young beautiful girls and the baby. You're covered in ice cream. Up to your ears, running around them so contentedly. Kieran came to pick them up as arranged. Oh, barely made it through the traffic, he exhaled. Some uncle jumped up to Eugene and me while we were fishing and began to claim that we had taken his permanent seat. So we squeezed the chair. There's his holy tire, there's his holy tire, there's his rotten rod stands, there's his driftwood. It's the first time in my life, Kieran continued. And you know me, if he'd asked nicely, we'd have left. Even after the rudeness, I said to him, look, you buy this place from the city on the copies, and the reservoir will be yours. In the meantime, behave yourself. You'll be better off with decent people. But you're like Jock Smith's favorite, said Vivian. You already have acquaintances I don't know. That's not my Maggie. Kieran replied that they were giggling for nothing. There's nothing to be amused about. I'll bring Maggie home and tell my grandfather that she has strange acquaintances, ostentatious macho men about whom nothing is known in the house. I've got to be serious and think more about my kids.